Good evening. Good evening, everyone. This is the Apologetics Academy. Hello and Happy New Year. This is the first Apologetics Academy webinar of 2018. This is a weekly apologetics interactive webinar where we bring on a special guest speaker to present on a topic of interest to Christians, particularly on topics that pertain to the question of whether Christianity is true. We also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews, including Islam, Mormonism, atheism, and so on. You can find our website at apologetics-academy.org, and there you can also find the schedule of upcoming webinars, as well as listen to recordings of past shows. The format generally is we have a speaker present for an hour or so, and then we open up for open floor Q&A, discussion, dialogue, and debate. There's a number of ways that you can participate in today's discussion. You can sit and listen anonymously if you wish. You can also participate in the chat window. You can click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker at the appropriate time when we get to the Q&A. And you can also submit questions in textual form anonymously if you wish by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Please, if you're going to be participating later, keep your questions cordial and respectful, even if you disagree with the speaker, and keep your questions succinct as well. So just to give you an idea of what's coming up in the next few weeks, next week we have Dr. John Roning, who's going to talk to us about why does John call Jesus the Word and why does it matter? He's the author of a book called The Jewish Targums and John's Logos Theology. So we're going to be having a discussion with him on that. And then the following week, we have Dr. Guillaume Bignon, who is a French philosopher, who's going to be talking to us on the subject of, is Calvinism excusing sinners and blaming God, giving a philosophical defense of a Calvinistic viewpoint. And then the following week, on Saturday, January 27th, we have Dr. Jay Smith, who's a well-known polemicist on the subject of Islam, who's going to be speaking to us on the subject of from one Quran to many Qurans, and basically discussing or examining the popular Muslim claim that all Arabic Qurans are the same and the Quran has been completely unchanged. So coming back to today's discussion then, we are very honored to have with us Analytic philosopher, Dr. Lydia McGrew, who is the author of the recent book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And she's going to be speaking to us today about 6 bad habits of New Testament scholars and how to avoid them. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Lydia. Thanks for coming on, Lydia.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonathan. I'm going to be going to share screen here in a minute to a PowerPoint presentation. This is the first time I have ever done this talk with PowerPoint, so we'll see how that goes. When I do that, I don't think I'll be able to see the chat window anymore, so I won't be able to reply during that time to chat until I cancel the share screen. But please do hang around and ask questions after I'm done. I'm going to try not to make this too long, but I have a lot of material to get to, so it's going to be fun. So let's go to the PowerPoint right now. Go to share screen. And okay, there we go. My talk today is called 6 Bad Habits of New Testament Scholars and How to Avoid Them. That title is pretty self-explanatory, with the one caveat that it is entirely about the Gospels. My talk is entirely about the Gospels. In fact, I had thought of changing the title to 6 Bad Habits of Gospel Scholars and How to Avoid Them, but my advisors said that didn't sound as good, so I'm sticking with this title. You'll notice that most of my examples are taken from scholars that are considered broadly evangelical, even conservative evangelical, not chiefly from Bart Ehrman or Raymond Brown or people out there who are not considered evangelical. There are a few exceptions that you'll see as we go along, but mostly from evangelical New Testament scholars and apologists and so forth. This is deliberate. My goal is to show these examples and these habits in a scholarly context where apologetics enthusiasts are more likely to trust the judgment of the authors involved. And my goal is to suggest that we should question the bad habits of New Testament scholarship no matter where we find them. Being labeled a evangelical or even being labeled a conservative is not a guarantee of infallibility and doesn't place one beyond criticism. It doesn't mean that we have to just assume that whatever that person is doing has been carefully vetted or rightly judged or whatever. And there is a lot of cross-pollination that goes on from mainstream New Testament scholarship, which is quite liberal New Testament scholarship, into evangelical scholarship. You'll see some of that in the examples I give today. So I want to show how this has happened so that we can question these things on their own merits. None of this is intended as a personal attack against anyone. The ideas are the thing. They're important ideas. We need to be able to discuss them vigorously and find out the truth. So my goal here is just the better understanding of the truth. I also wanted to mention that when I say these are bad habits, I mean they are philosophically and historically bad habits. This would be true even if the books were not scripture, even if they were not religious books. These are bad habits even when they're applied to Plutarch, for example. Yes, I do expect that people might be somewhat surprised to hear some of the theories that are being put forward by evangelical scholars, but my goal is not just to make us all kind of, my audience be shocked or think of these as bad habits in the sense of being impious or theologically bad in some a priori way. I want to show that these are important matters, but then I want to move on to show that these are logically and historically poor positions, not to suggest that we should just oppose them because we feel shocked by them or something like that. So bad habits here means intellectually bad habits. All right, that being said, let's go. Bad habit number one, failure to make crucial distinctions. It's amazing how often you see this, and this is something where I think that I, as an analytic philosopher, can help, because that's something analytic philosophers do all the time, is we come in there and we say distinguo, you're using this word univocally or something. So I want to start with an example, two senses of compression or telescoping. These are phrases you'll hear, terms you'll hear. Now, sometimes what you'll hear is that an author, like a gospel author, will tell things in a briefer way. He'll leave things out. He'll just not mention everything, not mention every detail. An illustration I've heard used is that it's like the guy version versus the girl version of a story, and that women allegedly like all the details, and men just like to hit the bullet points and so forth. That's fine for one sense of compression. That describes one sense of compression or telescoping. But there's another sense, a different sense, in which it is said that some author is telescoping. For example, if you read a New Testament scholar saying that Luke put all of the events of Jesus' appearances to his disciples on Easter Sunday, on that one day, he put them on that one day. Or you even read concerning some secular work that some Roman author put all of these events on December 3rd, when really they took 3 days from December 3rd to December 5th, and the author allegedly knew that. All right, now that's a very different sense of compression or telescoping from just leaving stuff out. If you just leave stuff out, you're just being indefinite. You're not specifically trying to give the impression that these things happened all in one day, or all in a much shorter time, or that certain people didn't say certain things, or anything like that. You're not trying to make your reader read your document in such a fashion that it gives the impression that this took a shorter time. Now, these two senses get melded all the time in New Testament scholars' writing. They'll say so-and-so compresses, and you'll hear that, and the reader may hear that as the first sense. He just leaves it out. And an author may even say, well, it's like the guy version and the girl version. But, frankly, whether it were a guy or a girl, if I heard someone say that a series of events that he knew took 40 days took one day, I would consider that misleading. I would not write that off as the guy version. If he were really putting all of the events that took 40 days onto one day, that's not something we would normally just call the guy version versus the girl version. So we need to keep those two senses distinct. And when somebody says this gospel author, in this case it's Luke, I'm giving an example from, is telescoping, we need to be explicit about what sense is meant by that, and draw that person out and say, now, what do you mean by that? And not assume that the I would call it fictionalizing sense, is just as unobjectionable as the merely leaving stuff out sense. Those are just completely different. And one might say, I don't think Luke would actually put all of the events on one day if he knew they took 40 days. That's not compatible with what I see elsewhere of Luke as an accurate author. Okay, and you shouldn't ever feel browbeaten by someone who just says, "Well, haven't you ever heard of telescoping? It's a technical term, and we know about it in New Testament scholarship." Well, that type of telescoping we aren't automatically bound to agree with or acknowledge. There needs to be a stronger argument for that stronger sense of telescoping or compression. Next, two senses of non-chronological order. This is very similar to the two senses of telescoping or compression. Now, what you often will find, and I'd say ancient authors have somewhat more of a tendency to do this than we do, but we do it sometimes too, is just what I call and chronology, or and but chronology. He did this and this, but he did this, but this happened. Okay, this is not implying a chronology. All right, this is not giving a specific chronology at all. This is just saying these things happened. They might not have happened in that precise way. In his 1984 book, Craig Blomberg talks about this sense of narrating in non-chronological order. An example of this would be the temptations in the wilderness, where you get a slightly different order between Matthew and Luke, but it's just, the words would just be and this happened. Okay, a word like kai or de in the Greek, so that Luke is not saying this happened after that happened. This happened first and then that happened. He's not necessarily implying a chronological order. You can't necessarily tell. Now, that's a very common trope of traditional harmonizers. I want to emphasize this. That fact that ancient people, and we sometimes too, are inexplicit about our chronology is not something that was discovered as a special compositional device used by the Greeks and Romans or something just discovered in the last year. That's something traditional harmonizers have been saying for many, many decades, actually hundreds of years. Okay, that sometimes you get a non-chronological narration that is not actually giving a chronological order. But let's go to the other sense of non-chronological order, or narrating it in the non-chronological order. When Jesus and his entourage are coming toward Jericho, we have in one gospel, we have in Mark, for example, that they saw these people who were blind when they were leaving Jericho. And Mark only mentions one blind man, and Jesus healed that blind man when they were leaving Jericho. In Luke, you have a mention of the healing of the blind man as they are approaching Jericho. And they're explicit. I mean, as they were approaching Jericho, as they were leaving Jericho. Okay. And that's a real issue for harmonization. Now, I think there are harmonizations that can be given there. They might have been leaving the old Jericho, approaching the new Jericho, or whatever. But if we say that Luke changed Mark's chronological order, okay, because he wanted to narrate the healing of the blind man, he only mentions one man, before they enter Jericho and Jesus meets Zacchaeus up in the sycamore tree, then that's not just narrating in non-chronological order. That's not the first sense. That's a different sense. That's having a chronological order and having a different chronological order from Mark's. In fact, these two senses are so different that they're incompatible. They're completely incompatible. Narrating in a order where you do not imply a chronology is incompatible with narrating in an order where you do imply a chronology and you've changed the chronology from someone else's. Maybe even changed it from what you have reason to believe was true. Okay, so one might and shouldn't have any objection to narrating in an inexplicit fashion about chronology, maybe narrating things in a more topic-oriented order or something like that, without even mentioning any chronology, versus laying out a chronology. Yeah, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, when you know it's the wrong chronology. You know it's not how it happened. And you might say, what's your argument that he did that? as opposed to, for example, having a source that told it a different way or in a different order? Why do you think he knew the true order and then said, no, I would prefer to tell my readers that it happened in a different order? That requires a much stronger argument. Next, two senses of ipsissima vox. Now that's a Latin phrase. It sounds very impressive. It means the very voice. Now there's actually a whole continuum of senses. This isn't just, like a very, very sharp, non-continuous distinction, but broadly speaking, all right, we could say we don't necessarily have the very words. So ipsissima vox is often contrasted with ipsissima verba, the exact words. We don't have the exact words of Jesus because maybe he spoke in Aramaic and the authors give it in Greek. Or maybe they paraphrased somewhat, moderate paraphrase, recognizable paraphrase. If you had been there, you would have said, oh, if you could go back in time and watch the scene, this is the time when Jesus is saying, I and the Father are one, okay? But it might have other words as well, or it might be worded somewhat differently, but it would be a recognizable paraphrase. It would be an incident where it would correspond to what was actually said by Jesus or by someone else. Sometimes the phrase is even used for other people, most often for the speech of Jesus. So there's a sense of, we don't have the exact words, but we have the very voice. We have something that's a recognizable paraphrase of what was said, or a translation into a different language or something like that. And naturally, that's going to have fuzzy edges. At what point does the paraphrase become so free that we don't call it the very voice, or we don't call it a paraphrase anymore? Well, now we'll go to the second sense, all right? I'll give an example. Jesus on the cross in the Synoptic Gospels is said to have said, my God, why have you forsaken me? In a paper in the year 2000 about the use of ipsissima vox in the Gospel of John and the words from the cross, Dan B. Wallace hypothesized that actually in John, when it says, I thirst, that Jesus said, I thirst, this was the so-called ipsissima vox modification, redaction of the tradition on the part of the gospel author of John of the phrase, the real phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me? So in other words, that if you had been there, you would not have recognizably heard Jesus say anything like, I am thirsty, that could have expressed physical thirst. You would have heard him say something that sounded like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that John modified this to I thirst, and meaning thirst in a metaphoric theological way. This theory is repeated in Dr. Michael Lacona's recent book, 2017 book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And Lacona appears to agree with Dr. Wallace on that point and credits him with the theory. Now that is said to be also ipsissima vox, but it's very understandable that someone might hear that and say, I wouldn't call that the very voice of Jesus. I wouldn't say that if Jesus never said, I am thirsty, in John, or anything like it, please give me a drink or whatever, and John recorded him as saying, I am thirsty, and even records people running and offering him something to drink at that very time, that this is then the very voice of Jesus, because I can make up some kind of theological theory connecting Jesus' sense of forsakenness by God with thirst, okay? That's not the ipsissima vox anymore. We might say that isn't the real voice, the very voice of Jesus anymore. It's very broad use of that phrase. If you want to insist that that's the very voice, you can define your words however you want, but you need to make it clear to people what you're talking about. And unfortunately, what happens a lot in New Testament scholarship, particularly with this one, with ipsissima vox, it happens with all of them, but particularly with ipsissima vox, is that you'll have there'll be some kind of controversy. Like there was the controversy about the I am statements and whether Jesus recognizably uttered anything like the I am statements. I'll be coming back to that later. And someone will be writing and trying to sort of set people's minds at rest and say, hey, everybody agrees that we don't have the very words of Jesus. All evangelical scholars agree. We have this thing called ipsissima vox, and it'll be this very technical sounding term, But when they're saying that to defend these very broad changes and calling them ipsissima vox, unfortunately, it's not always made clear to people that there is a narrower sense of it, and that this is an extremely broad sense, and that this is not uncontroversial among New Testament scholars and evangelical New Testament scholars. Not everybody accepts this very broad views of ipsissima vox, so there will be a kind of an equivocation on the term. And I don't think that's quite fair to the layman. I think the layman has a right to know that there's not you're not forced to a false dilemma here. Either you think we have, memorized the exact words of Jesus, everything, he didn't speak in a different language, no paraphrase, no nothing, and in which case you sound like a fundamentalist, very rigid person, or you have to be totally open to the idea that John changed "My God, why have you forsaken me?" to "I thirst." We should not force that kind of false dilemma on the layman, the pastor, the theological student, the apologist, or whatever. We need to recognize different senses of this term. One person I want to give a shout out to here, and I have not been in communication with this person at all, so he doesn't know I'm going to do this, but who did make this distinction, and so I want to give credit, is Rob Bowman, New Testament scholar, and in a post on the I am statements, he explicitly said there are different senses of ipsissima vox, and I think that Jesus uttered the I am statements in a historical sense, that if you had been there, you would have recognized his doing them. And he said it's possible to use this term in a sense that is too loose. I really appreciate that kind of clarity, and that's what we need. All right. Bad habit number 2. Where are we at? Okay. Moving through here. If I talk way too fast, Jonathan can come on and say, "You're talking too fast. People can't even hear you." Preference for more complex over simpler theories. Now, this is a big umbrella and covers a lot of ground. So I've put several things. The reason I have 6 bad habits this time and had 7 in an earlier version is that I combined 2 or 3 categories under this heading. So I'm going to go on. What's the first type of class of preference for more complex over simpler theories? A failure to recognize when a variation is just a variation, because sometimes a variation is just a variation. Like sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, okay? And you would be amazed at how New Testament scholars don't know how to do this. Example, in his commentary on Matthew, Robert Gundry is discussing the feeding of the 5,000, and Matthew uses the phrase "when evening came." In Mark, this is "it grew late." Mark says it when it grew late. And Gundry literally hypothesizes that "when evening came" was redacted from Mark's "when it grew late" because Matthew is attempting to allude to the Last Supper and trying to make the feeding of the 5,000 Eucharistic. Douglas Moo objected to this in a debate that they had in the pages of the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. And what Gundry had to say was, "Well, I have a lot of other places in the feeding of the 5,000 where I do the same thing." Yeah, he had a lot of other equally really, really bad arguments. In fact, Gundry, this I think is one, perhaps the only example I'm going to give from Gundry, because his work on Matthew was so extreme that I'm afraid people might say that he is not sufficiently typical. But it's just such a perfect example of this tendency not to be able to see that a variation is just a variation. Matthew is just telling the story in his own words. "When evening came" is a perfectly natural way of describing it. It has nothing to do with the Last Supper. Okay, similarly, in Mark, Jesus says, "I have not called the righteous, but sinners." Full stop, Mark 2:17. In Luke 5:32, Jesus says, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And he adds this phrase, "to repentance." In a 1999 paper called "An Apologia for the Broad Use of Ipsissima Vox," interesting title in light of what I was discussing a few minutes ago, Dan B. Wallace argues that Luke deliberately includes to repentance because of Luke's emphasis on the theme of repentance and the desire to make this the emphasis of Jesus' words. Mark's version, because he had been eating with the sinners, might have been seen as an invitation to a meal, so that Luke added to repentance by redaction to Jesus' words. Notice that there's no idea that Luke just talked to somebody who remembered it that way. It's just a variation of witness testimony. It's a natural variation. No, it has to be a redactive change. But sometimes a variation is just a variation. Another illustration from that same book, or same paper by Dan Wallace, is that when Matthew discusses in the days of Abiathar the high priest, which is in Mark 2:26, Jesus is talking about David eating the showbread, the sacred bread. This has caused people to question whether Jesus made an error, because at that time Abiathar wasn't yet high priest and so forth. Frankly, it's just like we might refer to President Reagan when he was still an actor or something like that. It's really not a problem. But Wallace conjectures that Matthew has this high Christology, and that Matthew might have been concerned that people reading Mark would think that Jesus made a mistake. And so Matthew deliberately suppressed in the days of Abiathar the high priest in order to avoid such a potential problem. But sometimes a variation is just a variation. Maybe Matthew was even present and just remembered that Jesus said, just didn't happen to remember that phrase, in the days of Abiathar the high priest. We're leaving out naturalness in variation. Everything is heavy redaction. Another example from that same paper by Dan Wallace, which I have, by the way, I have the paper, and I did not get it from Dr. Wallace. I got it from someone who had a copy. He's talking about in Mark 1:34, it talks about them bringing a lot of people to Jesus, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. Matthew 8:16, he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. Oh my goodness. Matthew he healed all the sick, and Mark he healed many who were sick. Well, you could probably think what I'm going to say for yourselves, right? What is Dr. Wallace going to conjecture? That Matthew, with his high Christology, is concerned that it might look like Jesus wasn't able to heal everybody, so that he deliberately, he's like looking at Mark and he's going, maybe it's, people might read he healed many, so he changed he healed many to he healed all. Matthew can't just tell the story in his own words. A variation is never just a variation. Another example of the preference, remember our overarching bad habit here, number 2 is preference for complex over simple theories, are what I call utterly unforced errors. An example here is the I thirst change that I gave as an example earlier. That's what I call an utterly unforced error. There is no even prima facie discrepancy between John and the synoptics. There's no discrepancy between Jesus saying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" and Jesus saying, "I thirst." He could have said both. These utterly unforced errors are a really egregious example of the preference for complex over simple theories. So that's an example. It's just that you just kind of, out of the clear blue sky, you bring up this theory that somebody changed something. Why do that? Why not just go with the simpler theory that Jesus said, "I thirst"? Another example of an utterly unforced error is the suggestion, this is in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, page 180, quote, "Perhaps John desired to allude to the event at Pentecost," and this was the motive given here is because John wasn't going to write about Pentecost, because he wasn't going to write a sequel like Luke did. Quote, "So he wove mention of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost into his communications with his male disciples." All right, so in other words, that John added that incident just to kind of somehow allude to the day of Pentecost. Utterly unforced error. It's unnecessary complexity rather than just taking it that Jesus did this thing. Maybe we don't know what it meant, especially if we're not Catholics. Catholics have a theory about what it was when he breathes on them and says, whoever sins you retain, they retain, and so forth. But the fact that we don't understand Jesus' words or Jesus' actions does not mean that the epistemically most reasonable theory is that the person made it up, that the evangelist made it up. I'm not going to take the time to discuss this next one. I can come back. It's in one of my posts on this, how many blind men and how many demoniacs were healed. Some very, very strange, complex theories about doublets and also about doubling up on demoniacs to make up for a demoniac you're not telling about somewhere else and so forth. Preference for complex over simple theories. Okay. Bad habit number 3, arguments from silence. Here I am going to give a very quick example from Bart Ehrman. When he's talking about the infancy narratives, he implies that there is a conflict between Matthew and Luke, because he says that in Matthew, Joseph and Mary were originally from Bethlehem. Now, where does he get this? The only place he can get it from is that in Matthew, it doesn't mention the journey to Bethlehem that is mentioned in Luke. So then out of this, Ehrman weaves this idea that Matthew is actually actively implying that they were like there in Bethlehem all along. But Matthew doesn't say that. That is an argument from silence on stilts to make an assertion in Matthew out of mere silence. Here's another example, which is also a failure to see that sometimes a variation is just a variation. We have the incident where in Mark 10, and it's also recounted in Mark 20, Jesus' disciples, James and John, come to him and ask him, can we sit on your right hand and on your left hand? And in Matthew, their mother is there with them, and she kneels down and asks this. But they're there. They're also there in Matthew. Mark does not mention their mother at all. He only mentions their coming and asking this. Now, one theory, and this is one of the 2 theories that Dr. Licona discusses in Why Are There Differences in the Gospel, and it's the one he says he prefers, is that Mark airbrushed out the mother of the sons of Zebedee and transfers her words to her sons. But in a sense, that is an argument from silence, because we aren't allowing the idea that Mark just didn't know about the mother, that this could be a more natural variation. Instead of Mark somehow knowing the story as it's given in Matthew, and Matthew wouldn't even have been written yet, so would have had to know about it in some other way, and then saying, I think I shall airbrush out the mother, instead of just, maybe Peter didn't remember the mother. Okay. Sometimes a variation is just a variation. But again, that's an argument from silence in a sense, because Mark's non-mention of the mother is treated as if he has deliberately taken the mother out. We're looking for this heavy reason for silence. This one's interesting. An unnecessary tension between John and the Synoptics on whether the voice spoke from heaven. So here's a discussion from Dr. Lacona's book of that passage in John concerning John the Baptist and Jesus and the baptism. Quote, in all 3 synoptics, God's voice testifies that Jesus is his son. However, in John 1:32 through 34, there is no mention of a voice from heaven, nor is there a mention of heaven being opened. There's your argument from silence. We're going to take silence of John. Instead, interesting word, instead, John the Baptist says God told him he would provide him with a sign. The Spirit would descend and remain upon the one he had chosen to baptize. And it is John the Baptist rather than, this is my emphasis, but I'm drawing attention, rather than God, who directly testified that he saw the sign and testified that Jesus is God's son. Therefore, in the synoptics, the voice from heaven directly testifies that Jesus is God's son, whereas in John, it is John the Baptist. This is the creation of an unnecessary tension between John and the synoptics by an argument from silence. Because John doesn't mention the voice from heaven and the heavens being opened, there's this notion that it's, John the Baptist testifying instead of God the Father. The really interesting thing here is that this actually causes Lacona apparently not to see or not to be able to recognize an undesigned coincidence, which I discuss in my book, because there is an undesigned coincidence here raised by the question, how did John the Baptist know that Jesus was the Son of God? He says, I saw and bear record that he was the Son of God, but there's been no mention of the Son of God. And the voice from heaven from the synoptics actually answers that question. So far from it being instead or whereas or rather than or whatever, they actually fit together as question and answer. And that's very common. By not allowing natural variations, we get natural variations in testimony, and in a testimonial form, we get tensions rather than being capable of recognizing undesigned coincidences, which are actually a feature of the natural variation of testimony. One more, real quick. I'm going back to the 1999 paper on Ipsissima Vox by Dan B. Wallace. He talks about Matthew 24:36, where Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour that the Son of Man will come. And you probably are all familiar with the fact that in some manuscripts of Matthew and also in Mark, unequivocally, he says the Son doesn't even know, nor the Son. All right, and this has created questions of the deity of Christ, etc. Now, Wallace argues on textual grounds that the phrase should not be included in Matthew 24. Now, textual criticism is Dr. Wallace's specialty. That doesn't mean we have to accept all of his judgments about interpretation of the scriptures. But so it's not a problem for him to say the best manuscripts don't have nor the Son. So nor the Son isn't in Matthew 24:36. Fine. But he goes on to suggest, you guessed it, that Matthew deliberately omitted nor the Son because of his high Christology. That we wouldn't want people to get the idea, in other words, maybe Jesus really said nor the Son, but I don't want to confuse people, so I'm going to leave that out. I'm going to deliberately omit it in order to support my high Christology. I'm going to suppress that on the part of Jesus. This again is an argument from silence. That first we argue that it's not in Matthew, and maybe it's not, wasn't in the original manuscript of Matthew, and then we have to have a heavy theory for why it's not in Matthew, and it's this theological Christological theory. But sometimes a variation is just a variation. In fact, I would argue often in the Gospels, usually in the Gospels, a variation is just a variation. Okay. Bad habit number 4. Ignoring the possibility of independent access to events. Now, I want to mention here, there's a speech that Dr. Lacona gave that he put up on the internet just this past summer of 2017, on the deity of Christ. At a certain point in that speech, he's explaining to his audience what the two-source hypothesis is, because he's going to want to mention Q. So he gives them a brief rundown of the two-source hypothesis. And in summarizing that, he says that if a story is in both Mark and Matthew, then what scholars say is that Matthew got it from Mark. Now, I find this kind of interesting because not only could you have a much looser version of the two-source hypothesis, but it's also a weird way of implying that you accept Matthean authorship, because just a few minutes earlier, he's envisaged someone asking, well, if Matthew was a disciple, why did he need to use Mark as a source? And he talks about high prestige of Peter and so on. So for the people, for his audience, and maybe for sure for himself, I don't know, he seems to be accepting Matthean authorship of Matthew, at least as a working hypothesis. But then when he gets to explaining the two-source hypothesis, he says, if the story's in both Matthew and Mark, Matthew got it from Mark. Well, good grief. I mean, if that doesn't have to be, if Matthew was genuinely Matthew, if he was one of the 12, he may have had independent access to the events. So the minute we lock ourselves into this incredibly rigid version, very narrow version of the two-source hypothesis, so that anytime we say it's the same incident, Matthew had to get it from Mark, we're cutting out the possibility of Matthew's having independent access to the same event. So here are a couple more examples of Matthew's variations from Mark. We've actually had a couple of these already. So you can think for yourself back to my earlier examples and see how this fits in. Just here are two more. Cursing the fig tree. It's a very famous crux that Matthew's chronology of the cursing of the fig tree seems to be different from Mark's. I'm not going to summarize that because I'm trying to move quickly. And it does seem to be different from Mark's. I totally grant that this is difficult chronologically to harmonize. Okay, but if we think that Matthew might have really been there, maybe Matthew remembered it this way. All right, maybe this is how Matthew remembered it. If we put on the table as a hypothesis that Matthew may have had independent access, maybe he remembered it as withering more quickly than what Mark describes. Now, you can do what you want to do with that for your theory of inerrancy or whatever. I would submit to you, however, that it is not any help to inerrancy, and certainly not any help to the reliability of the Gospels, to have Matthew deliberately, we're going to go back now to our first point about two different senses of compression, to have Matthew deliberately falsifying the events and saying, I'm going to make it all happen at once, even though I know it didn't all happen at once, because I want to shorten it up or whatever. If that's your idea of inerrancy, it certainly isn't mine. And from a historical point of view, again, I said these are historically bad habits. It's a very bad habit not to allow the possibility of independent access to the events and therefore independent memory. Another example, what did Jairus say about his daughter? All right, in Mark, Jairus comes running up and he says, my daughter is at the point of death. And then as they're traveling to see the child, Jesus is going to go heal her, the servants come and say, she has died. In Matthew, he runs up and he says, my daughter has just now died. And then there's no mention of the servants, and they get there, and as in Mark, they find the people wailing for her death. Well, what did he say? Well, now this is the kind of incredibly natural variant that you get between eyewitnesses. Very, very, very natural. If you were to ask someone like J. Warner Wallace, who's a detective, about how different eyewitnesses tell stories, that kind of thing is just what you would find. That one person just doesn't remember some small variation saying, my daughter is about to die, and then he has to learn later that she really has died, versus running up and saying, my daughter is dead. If Matthew was written even 10 years after, which is still an extremely early date for Matthew, and all the more so the further out you get, this would be a very natural memory variation. But that doesn't mean he didn't say, my daughter has died. Maybe he said both, or whatever. But when we allow Matthew, when we don't treat Mark as the only reliable guy, and Matthew's always redacting Mark, we allow Matthew independent access to the events as well, then for one thing, we have a motive to harmonize. We'll see that in a second. And for another thing, we can take seriously these natural sources of variation rather than having it be a redaction. That Matthew read it in Mark, he wasn't there, or we're just not going to talk about whether he was there or not because we're acting like Matthew wasn't Matthew. Because, I don't know, the New Testament Scholarship Guild wouldn't like it if we acted like Matthew was really Matthew, and we gave that any power as an explanatory hypothesis. We're going to just assume he got it from Mark. If it's in both, he got it from Mark. And so then he must have deliberately cut this out instead of remembering it differently. These and many others could be differences of independent memory access between Matthew and the other Gospels rather than redactions. All right. This next one is pretty important. I almost cut it out for time's sake, but I'm leaving it in. Dr. Licona and others, he's certainly not the only one by a long shot, alleges a contradiction concerning the place of Jesus' first meeting with the disciples after his resurrection. If you're familiar with harmonization and the Easter accounts, you'll be familiar with this, that Matthew only mentions a meeting in Galilee. Matthew, and the long ending of Mark, I'm taking it as not authentic, so we don't have any appearances in Mark, so we can leave Mark out. But John and Luke both discuss meetings right in Jerusalem, even right on the very same day of Jesus' resurrection. But Matthew moves very quickly to a meeting in Galilee. Now, I think these are completely harmonizable. I don't think they were the same meeting. I don't think there's really a problem here. But it is common among skeptics and even some Christian New Testament scholars to allege that these are contradictory. Dr. Licona is insistent that these are the same meeting. He spends several pages discussing this and why are there differences in the Gospels, that John's first meeting of Jesus with the disciples and Matthew's first recounted meeting are the same meeting, but then now we have a contradiction because one is in Galilee and the other is in Jerusalem. This contradiction could, of course, be avoided if we didn't insist that they were the same meeting. And interestingly, he says that he conjectures, he says, I don't know why they contradict each other on this, but perhaps they followed different traditions. Now, let's just think about that for a minute. If John had access, let's even just consider for a moment the wild hypothesis. After all, we're historians. We're supposed to be considering all theories, right? Then let's give this one a test drive. John was John. Matthew was Matthew. They were there. Then they are not following traditions. They remember these meetings, all right? Failure to consider independent access to events. That's the bad habit number 4 we're talking about here. Okay, why are we talking about John and Matthew following traditions? As if their memories were erased and they have to go find somebody else to tell them where Jesus first met his disciples. If we're going to say John wasn't John and Matthew wasn't Matthew, let's come right out and say it. That their only access to the events, they didn't have their own independent access. Their only access was tradition. Okay, but that then needs to be defended on its own grounds. Interestingly, if you take seriously the idea that John and Matthew had reliable, independent access to the events, this could make you rethink the possibilities of harmonization concerning Jesus' meetings in Galilee versus his meetings in Jerusalem, and be more open to harmonization because you think these things you have reason to believe these things came from sources, eyewitness sources who actually remembered them. So maybe they're both true. Okay. Similarly, Craig Keener raises and dismisses the possibility concerning the temple cleansing. Familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that Jesus cleanses the temple in John early in his ministry, and then there's no mention of a cleansing in Passion Week. And in the Synoptic Gospels, it talks about his cleansing the temple in Passion Week, and there's no mention of a temple cleansing early on. Again, I think he just cleansed the temple twice. I don't think there's really a problem here. But when Dr. Keener talks about this in his commentary on John, he simply says, maybe John depends on a separate tradition, but probably not. I think John moved it for theological reasons. And he has this very elaborate theory. This falls, again, back under the preference for complex over simple theories. And if someone wants to ask me in the Q&A what Dr. Keener's theory is about the theological moving of the temple cleansing, I can tell you that. But here I'm just pointing out that he says briefly, perhaps John depends on a different tradition. Again, if John himself had access to the events, he might have remembered that Jesus cleansed the temple early in his ministry, in which case perhaps we should reconsider the possibility that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, instead of doing a priori history and saying, oh, it's very unlikely that they would have allowed him to cleanse the temple again, or whatever your theory is, or that they would have allowed his ministry to continue. Don't do a priori history. Do history from your documents. Do history from your sources when you have reason to believe that those sources have access to the events. But here what we get is this tacit assumption that we're not going to really give that much weight, that John was really there and really saw that. In fact, we're going to treat it like it isn't even true. The most we will consider, maybe John depended on a separate tradition. We're going to treat him as very removed from the events, and then we find that easier to dismiss for a different theory that John moved the temple cleansing. All right, last one under this bad habit. In his commentary on Matthew, Craig A. Evans talks about Matthew 20. We already talked about this passage a few minutes ago with the sons of Zebedee, the brothers James and John, and their mother. Evans has a slightly different theory. This is cited in Licona's book, but not endorsed as strongly. Licona says he prefers the theory that Mark airbrushed out the mother, but he puts these almost on par. It's kind of interesting. He He lists them both, and then you have to go to a footnote to find out that he prefers the one about Mark airbrushing out the mother. Dr. Evans's argument is that Matthew added the mother because he, quote, seeks to put the disciples in a better light. That would presumably be James and John, that it was mom's idea, it wasn't their idea. Now, this is very interesting and striking because if you're going to put the disciples in a better light by making up a character and her involvement out of whole cloth, presumably the readers are supposed to believe it. We can come back to that later in Q&A if we want to talk about this, but sometimes there's a statement that's made that, oh, the people at the time didn't take these things to be really asserted at all, so they wouldn't have been misled. But how do you cast the disciples in a better light by making up the involvement of mom if the readers do not believe it? Okay, if the readers don't believe mom was actually involved, then they're not going to think of James and John in a better light. In any event, again, this is ignoring the possibility that Matthew remembered mom, that Matthew was actually there, or even for that matter, if you prefer, that Matthew talked to somebody who was there, ignoring the possibility of reliable, independent access to the real events. Everything is a redaction, a redaction, a redaction. Matthew read Mark, and then he decided to juice up the story, beef up the story, and add mom. And it's interesting because Dr. Evans even notices that Matthew has James and John there anyway. So how much better does it make them look? If they're present and they're putting their oar in and they're dialoguing with Jesus, yeah, we want to be on your right hand and your left hand, that doesn't really make them that much less proud or whatever to make them involved. And all he'll say is that Matthew knows Mark's version. This doesn't cause Dr. Evans to say, oh, maybe Matthew's just remembering something that wasn't known to Mark. He just takes it as more evidence for redaction, that Matthew knows Mark's version. Again, it's a pathology of New Testament scholarship not to allow the natural variation of those who have access to the events. Matthew is erased as a potential witness. All right, bad habit number 5. Oh, this isn't too bad. All right, over time-wise, that is overreading. If you ever watch Chariots of Fire, you may remember the coach, Sam Musabini, and he says to the sprinter, Harold Abrams, overstriding, it's death to the sprinter. Well, I'm going to say overreading is death to the New Testament scholar, and all too common. Now, many other examples we have given already fit into this as well, for sure. Many times these examples I give could have multiple labels. It's not like I just have to give them one label. And in fact, I had my slide here. I had the Bart Ehrman example of Mary and Joseph originally living in Bethlehem as an example under overreading, and I moved it over to arguments from silence. So, all right, so here's another example. This is related again to an alleged contradiction between Matthew and John concerning the first appearance to Mary Magdalene. I'm going to quote here from Dr. Lacona's book, page 175. The story differs, he's just described John, then he says, the story differs in Matthew 28, 8 through 10, in which, upon hearing the message of the angel at the tomb, the group of women, which included Mary Magdalene, left quickly with fear and trembling and ran to tell Jesus' disciples, unquote. And then in Matthew, the group that leaves together meets Jesus. He appears to them. All right, notice that the group of women, which included Mary Magdalene, this is overreading. If you open up the Bible, what you see, verse 1 of Matthew 28, now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other woman came to look at the grave, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, and it goes on. It describes the angel, etc. And then you get to, after the message of the angel, verse 8, and they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to report it to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. Verses 8 and 9. Notice verse 1 does not say that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were the only women who were present. It just says they did come. Mary Magdalene is not named as it goes on. She's not named. in the rest of it. It names her at the beginning, and I didn't read all 8 verses. You can read them for yourself. When you get to verse 8 and 9, it says they left, but it doesn't say which included Mary Magdalene. All right, this is an overreading, and this reduces our capacity for harmonization. When you read Matthew naturally with John and you treat them as you would treat independent witness testimony, again, for historical reasons, you can see that Mary Magdalene left immediately when she saw the tomb open, that the stone was rolled away, and ran back to Peter and John and told them that they had taken away the body. Somebody's taken away the body. And so it's the rest of the women then who get the opportunity to hear the angel at that time and who leave and meet Jesus. That is a very natural harmonization. That's not a weird harmonization. But by saying among which included Mary Magdalene, then you cut off the possibility for harmonization. Lacona concludes that either Matthew or John has quote unquote relocated the first appearance to Mary. In other words, either Matthew knew that she first met Jesus in the garden as described by John, and just for some strange reason decided to make her first meet Jesus with the other women, because he thinks that's what Matthew is implying here. Or John knew that she first met Jesus with the other women and made her first encounter Jesus in the garden of the tomb by herself in that incredibly beautiful, poignant scene. And I just want to point out that if John in that way relocated the first appearance to Mary Magdalene, that is an entire incident that John has made up. Dr. Lacona leaves it undecided which of these so-called relocations has occurred. I want to note here under this example the curiously static nature of redaction criticism in the Bible. If Mary Magdalene is with this group of women, then by golly, she has to stay with this group of women. People don't move around. Things don't take place over periods of time. Different passages, if possible, must always be interpreted to refer to the same moment in time. Redaction treats everything as a snapshot or even as a stone carving. Real life is a moving picture. When I was giving an earlier version of this talk, I was told that a gentleman in the audience who was not a scholar, he was an interested layman who had come to my talk, leaned over and said to his wife in the middle of my talk, "These guys need to get out more." And that's part of what I'm trying to give here. These guys need to get out more. And if they did, they wouldn't do so much overreading. Just one more for this example. I want to read John 13:1 for you here. Got it written down. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, rose from supper. All right. Now I want to draw your attention to an overreading of this passage. This is another example from Dr. Lacona's book. This is on page 155. However, there are several elements in John's gospel that suggest he has located the Last Supper a day earlier than what is portrayed in the synoptics. First, in John 13:1, the Last Supper is eaten, and now he puts the next words in quotation marks, before the Passover, close quote, close quote. Whoa! All right, suppose you didn't open your Bible. Suppose you were just reading that in the book. Okay, and this point that he makes is in John 13:1, he states the Last Supper is eaten before the feast of the Passover. And he puts part of it in quotation marks, but John does not say that the Last Supper is eaten before the feast of the Passover. You have to go look it up for yourself, and you see that this is an overreading. In fact, the Greek verb of the sentence that includes the phrase before the feast of the Passover is he loved, not they ate. It's not that they ate the feast. It says, before the feast of the Passover, having loved his own, he loved them. And in fact, if you're going to go on and say during supper in the very next verse, which I just read to you, that kind of naturally refers to the feast. I mean, if I were saying before Christmas, it was really, really incredibly cold around here. And during dinner, I looked out the window and I said, man, I hope we get a thaw soon. That dinner would very naturally refer to Christmas that I had just mentioned. So actually a very natural reading is actually that the supper is the feast of the Passover John has just mentioned. But by an overreading, Dr. Licona takes it that it says that the Last Supper is eaten before Passover, thereby creating a tension with the synoptics and supporting a claim that John has changed a day, has changed the relationship of Jesus' death to the Passover. Last one under this bad habit. When does Peter go to the tomb when the women announce the empty tomb? All right, so I want to read just a little bit of Luke 24, 8 through 10. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things. This is after the women have seen, or at least some group of women have seen an angel. They told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter arose and ran to the tomb. And then it goes on, describes Peter going to the tomb. Now, this is inexplicit chronology. This takes us back to our two senses of narrating non-chronologically that I talked about at the very beginning. The but here, but Peter rose and ran to the tomb, is de in Greek. Absolutely classic example of a word that does not indicate a chronology. This has been discussed by many, many people. In general, that de, like kai, does not indicate a chronology. Luke is doing this highfalutin thing that I like to call chunking things in. He's just chunking things in. And they like to do that. If you ever hear a kid, and I'm not saying Luke is like a kid, but this is where we run into it more in our own time. And we went to the zoo, and we saw a squirrel, and we went to the park, and we had ice cream cones. He is not necessarily saying that they did it in that order, okay? Similarly, Luke does not say that Peter rose and ran to the tomb only after, by golly, okay, all the women had come and told these things to him, all right? But Dr. Licona states, Peter ran to the tomb when the women, including Mary Magdalene, made the announcement to the disciples. Now, he uses this to argue that you can't harmonize the account in the different accounts by saying that Mary Magdalene came first alone, okay? And only later would the larger group of women have talked to Peter. A very natural harmonization, such as I was just laying out, is that Mary came back, and John and Peter went to the tomb, and they didn't talk to the other women until later on. But because Luke says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women who told these things to the apostles at some point, but Peter arose and so forth, that Peter only arose after he had talked to all the women. That's overreading. That's overreading. That's insisting that Luke is making a chronology when he isn't. All right, our last bad habit. How are we doing for time? All right, downgrading factual reliability. Now, I'm going to just tell you, I called this in my other talk, throwing reliability under the bus. I decided that maybe that was a little bit harsh sounding, so I've changed it to downgrading factual reliability. All right. Now, what this involves in many cases is redefining reliability. So we're going to say, we don't want to say that these are unreliable. We just want to say they aren't really all that concerned with literal factual truth. But God forbid anybody should call that unreliable. Well, that's a redefinition of unreliable and a redefinition of reliable, and that's downgrading the importance of factual reliability. So I want to talk first about Craig A. Evans on John. You can watch this video for yourself. It's included. I have embedded in one of my New Testament posts. And I'm going to be giving URLs at the end to a lot of what I've written on this if you browse, or you can Google it for yourself. In a debate with Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman asked, rather snobbily, as Ehrman has a way of doing, do you really believe that Jesus said all this stuff about I and the Father are one, and I am, before Abraham was, I am, and all that? He's very, very dismissive. Do you really believe this? And they're sitting there facing each other on the stage. And Dr. Evans states that he has a lot of agreement with Ehrman on this very subject. So here's a quote. I'm going to read it from here because I can see it better. And he uses genre to try to deflect what Ehrman is saying, while essentially agreeing with Ehrman that John did not make recognizably the I am statements. Now, this gets back to the two senses of ipsissima vox, because this was later defended by the use of the phrase ipsissima vox, that what Jesus really said were things like what we find in the synoptics, calling himself the Son of Man, for example, which does have implications of deity, or claiming to be able to forgive sins, which certainly has implications of deity, which were these somewhat more inexplicit claims to deity, and that John wrote up later these in a far different form before Abraham was I am. I and the Father are one. And these incidents where Jesus made these claims, and that this is just ipsissima vox. Well, that's a very, very broad use of ipsissima vox, and that is what Dr. Evans is promoting here. My view is the Gospel of John is a horse of another color altogether. It's a different genre, in other words, a different genre from historical reportage. John is often compared to the wisdom literature. It's like wisdom is personified, Chokmah, Lady Wisdom, or in Greek, Sophia. She wanders the streets. She calls out to people. She does things. Well, nobody would read that and think, oh, did you see Wisdom going down the street the other day? Nobody would think that is a literal person. Now, okay, so he's making John out to be like some kind of parable or personifying allegory. Now he has to admit there's a little problem with that. What is mysterious to me about John is that once you say that, and that is what he's saying, and say, okay, perhaps we should interpret the I am statements as he is confessions. He is the light of the world. He is the way, truth, and life. He is the bread of life. A confession of the Johannine community that likely generated that version of the gospel. About the time you think John is a gigantic parable, then along comes a scholar who says, you know, it's loaded with historical details also. So I don't disagree with you. This is Bart Ehrman he's talking to. Too much on that point. This is the point that Jesus never made the I am statements. Okay, he doesn't disagree with Bart Ehrman too much on this. I think John is studded with historical details. We're going to put a little plug for some historical details in John. Maybe you called them nuggets. Apparently, Ehrman had used the phrase nuggets. That's not a bad way of describing John, but I think synoptics are more than just some nuggets. So, in other words, we are dehistoricizing John here to a very large extent while admitting that there are just some nuggets of historical details. Now, Ehrman, as you can well imagine, jumped right on that and said, which frankly I think wasn't a legitimate question, okay, if John isn't historically reliable, which gospel is? Okay. You leave a door like that wide open, Bart Ehrman's going to walk right through. Well, you may hear Dr. Evans protested against Bart Ehrman's calling the Gospel of John unreliable. Yep, he did. This is how he protested. And by the way, Bart, I object to saying it's not historically accurate. Well, if something that isn't exactly historical, how is it not historically accurate? It'd be like saying, you mean the parable? The parable was a fiction Jesus told. It's not historically accurate. So how does he protest? By downgrading the historical accuracy of John very explicitly as a source of literal historical information. He's saying that it's not a legitimate criticism to criticize John as ahistorical because that's the genre it is anyway. Not a ringing endorsement of the historical reliability of John, and I might add, a completely unnecessary and gigantic concession. We have every reason to believe that John is intending to be historically accurate. Richard Burridge on John. Now, Richard Burridge I don't think would call himself an evangelical. I don't know. I haven't heard anyone ask him. I'm including him here because he's been very influential upon evangelicals. Particularly through his work on the supposed genre of the Gospels, been very influential on Dr. Lacona. He and Lacona appeared together on the British radio show Unbelievable to discuss this. And this is what Richard Burridge says about John in his book, Four Gospels, One Jesus, a Symbolic Reading. We must not transfer these modern concepts to ancient texts without considering their understandings of truth and myth, lies and fiction. To modern minds, myth means something untrue, a fairy story. In the ancient world, myth was the medium whereby profound truth, more truly true than mere facts could ever be, was communicated. The opposite of truth is not fiction, but lies and deception. Yet even history can be used to deceive, while stories can bring truth. Maybe you should have capitalized truth. This issue of truth and fiction in the ancient world is too complex to cover in detail here. However, the most important point to remember is that the ancients were more interested in the moral worth and philosophical value of statements than their logical status in truth, more than facts. Unfortunately, debate between so-called conservatives and liberals about authenticity is often conducted in 21st century terms. As one student asked me, why does John keep fabricating material about Jesus despite his expressed concern for the truth? However, the negative connotation of fabrication is modern. I want it to sink into you that Dr. Burridge is out there teaching his students that John keeps fabricating material about Jesus, but that this doesn't matter because we shouldn't care, because they didn't care, because all those ancient people didn't care about mere facts, because they're teaching higher truth. And you're just being anachronistic by caring about mere facts. That's wrong, by the way. John is very explicit that he cares about literal facts. Okay, downgrading historical reliability. Dr. Lacona on John. Also, John is such a whipping boy. My emphasis here is on the word often. That's emphasis is not in the original, but I'm drawing your attention to it. John often chose to sacrifice accuracy on the ground level of precise reporting, preferring to provide his readers with an accurate, higher level view of the person and mission of Jesus. All right, this is a pretty clear admission. Not just John did it occasionally, but John did it often. Ooh, I'm getting behind on my time. Okay. And yet, on numerous occasions, Dr. Lacona has objected to it's being said that these views are making the Gospels unreliable. But you cannot just redefine reliability. If you're going to say that John often chose to sacrifice accuracy in this area, then that's going to mean that he's not accurate in that literal area. Okay, and I'm willing to add phrases like literal reliability, factual reliability, reliability on the ground level of precise reporting, but that is what we're talking about not doing, and it's not just John. I'm not going to read this entire quote, but in a interview with Bible Gateway that just came out this summer, Dr. Lacona stated that he prioritizes what he calls genre over harmonization, to the point that he says, again, this is my emphasis, before seeking to harmonize the texts, the gospel texts, one should read the Gospels in view of their biographical genre, which includes their authors' use of various compositional devices commonly used when writing history and biography. So this is before harmonization. Now, this might explain what I called utterly unforced errors, because if you're not even going to try to harmonize first, if you just are going to try to think of some way that something might have been changed or whatever, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get unforced errors. This is really a violation of Occam's razor. We're not trying to go for the simpler hypothesis that they believed what they said first. And I'm speaking here as an epistemologist. I work professionally on the issue of reliability. I'm going to say this is not the way you would treat any testimony if you thought it was reliable. Because if you think the two testimonies are reliable and they can be harmonized, you will harmonize them. Because if they both have some claim to reliability, you're going to assume that, they may not be absolutely perfectly infallible, but that if you can fit them together, great. I thought they were both reliable to begin with. And so I can see that they're both telling the truth, even in these varied details. They fit together and both things happened or whatever and so forth. So if you prioritize something else over harmonization, you are not treating the text as reliable. Again, I'm not going to read this entire quote. This concerns the infancy narratives. Dr. Lacona is very This was in an online debate with Bart Ehrman in 2016. Bart Ehrman, scorns the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke as unreliable. And Dr. Licona apparently thinks there's some major problem. In my opinion, those narratives include the most difficult and profound differences in the Gospels. That's a pretty strong statement. So then he conjectures, and he says, I don't know what's happening, but maybe this is it. Let's just speculate for a moment and consider the following scenario. Matthew and Luke both agree that a Jewish virgin named Mary, who was engaged to a Jewish man named Joseph, gave birth to Jesus in Bethlehem. The early Christians all knew this much. However, little else was remembered about this event. Bear that in mind. So Matthew and Luke added details, quote unquote, to their account to create a more interesting narrative of Jesus' birth. And then he inaccurately calls this midrash. That would definitely not be a midrash. And he considers this a plausible suggestion, he says up above. This would relegate the shepherds, the wise men, the star of the manger, the flight to Egypt, the slaughter of the innocent to the level of details which are on this theory questionable. The term questionable is used. Those are entire incidents. So this is not treating the accounts as reliable at all, especially since there's no contradiction between Matthew and Luke on many of these things, even though they're not part of this overlapping core that he talks about. There's also a mistake here in probability concerning multiply attested. The core itself could stand, and he talks a bit later that it would be multiply attested. I can get into that in Q&A. So this again is downgrading historical accuracy. We don't have any reason to do that for the Gospels. We have reason to believe that they were historically accurate and intended to be so in these literal senses, not just some higher truths such as Burridge discusses, but in the area of facts. All right, got to move on. How to avoid these bad habits. Tip number 1, recognize them. Sounds simple. You'd be surprised. When you get involved in a discipline, you go to seminary or you start reading a lot of things and you find that something is accepted, all right? There's this sociological tendency to say, oh, that argument might have sounded a little odd to me, but all these guys whom I call evangelicals or whatever, they seem to think it's okay. So I guess I should just adopt their methodology, their way of proceeding. So I'm going to encourage you to recognize these as bad habits, which will free you to question them, okay? No matter who's putting them forward. Not to feel like, well, if this is something they do in the discipline, I guess it must be okay. That doesn't follow. 2, look at the text. We did that. In several places. This would especially concern overreadings, avoiding overreadings, looking at possibilities for harmonization, seeing that a variation is just a variation, avoiding the use of an unnecessarily complicated theory, all kinds of things. If somebody says the text says this, according to John, the Passover is eaten, the Last Supper is eaten before the feast of the Passover. Open up the text and look at it, not because it's the Bible, not because it's, the Bible and it's a sacred holy text and we have to go look at the Bible, but because this is what you should do for any historical text, is go investigate it for yourself. I did this for Plutarch when I read the Plutarch sections of Dr. Licona's book, and again and again and again and again, I found that he was alleging that Plutarch had changed the chronology, for example, and I would go read it and I'd say, but Plutarch's just being really inexplicit about the chronology there. Okay, Plutarch isn't changing the chronology, or there's really no contradiction between these two versions of the story in Plutarch. So look at the text for yourself. Tip number 3, check out things for yourself. So that sounds like I'm repeating tip number 2, but I mean in a broader sense of reading arguments. Go read what I've written on this topic, read the books for yourself and so forth. Do not be overawed by bandwagons or credentialism. The arguments and the evidence are what it's all about. Don't say, oh, I can't read Greek, or I can't do this, or I don't have this credential, so I can't decide for myself. Well, in that case, you're going to have to say eeny, meeny, miny, mo, because there are critics on both sides of this, including dead ones, and dead scholars deserve their voice to be heard as well. The late John Wenham just died in 1996. I would put his Greek credentials up against anybody's, and he thinks the resurrection narratives are harmonizable. So it's not like, you're just a fool and you can't possibly, if you read the Greek, you would just be, struck over the head with the truth of these redactive theories, or that the gospel authors changed certain facts. By no means. So if you're not going to decide arbitrarily on an expert to follow, you're going to need to check things out for yourself, and you can. Okay, you can. You can read, and you can read arguments, and you can see what arguments hold up, and catch yourself if you feel tempted to say to someone else, well, everybody thinks this, or well, you don't have these credentials, so you shouldn't put an argument forward on this. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just go for the arguments in and of themselves. Tip 4, recognize that harmonization is not religious. It's a normal historical process. This is so important. New Testament scholars are like the princess and the pea when it comes to harmonization. Just like the princess had no tolerance for even a tiny little pea down under 6 mattresses, New Testament scholars have no tolerance for harmonization. And I believe that this arises from the fact that they have learned to characterize it to themselves and among themselves as a religious process. Well, if you're an inerrantist, then you feel like you have to, and you're going to be waterboarding the text to make it tell you what you wanted to say, etc. And we can be free to say that John made this up or changed this or whatever. Actually, harmonization is good historical practice. It's good historical practice. It's not something we do because of piety. It's something we should do because of history. And this is the last long thing I want to talk about, but I'll only read part of it. This is the case of the Swiss messenger. And this is from someone named Johannes Ebrard, writing in 1863. These old guys had a lot of good things to say. He talks about different reports that appeared not to be harmonizable. All right? And I'm not going to go into the historical background here, but the report that troops had been sent for to burn to overawe the people, and that they might arrive at any moment, had produced the greatest excitement. The people armed on every hand and were ready at the shortest notice to march to Zurich or meet the Bernese forces. This occurred in Switzerland. On the evening of the 5th of September, information was received by the leaders of the popular movement that there was no foundation for the report. They immediately caused several hundred letters to be written and dispatched in all directions for the purpose of quieting the people. Now, one person informed me that late in the evening, N, just a name, was sent with a letter to Pfeffikon. Another told me that N was sent in the evening to Pfeffikon, but after going a short distance returned with the report that the alarm bell had already been rung in Pfeffikon. A third related that 2 messengers had been sent on horseback to Pfeffikon, and a fourth that N had sent 2 men on horseback to Pfeffikon. If any 4 accounts ever seemed irreconcilable, these did. And if a harmonist had attempted to reconcile the whole on the supposition that N was sent, but met 2 messengers from Pfeffikon who reported the outbreak of the riot, that he turned back with them to Zurich, where he immediately procured horses and sent them back in all speed to quiet the people, it would be rejected as a most improbable and artificial conjecture. Yet this was a simple explanation which I received from N himself when I asked him what the facts of the case really were. Now, inscribe this next sentence on your mind. We see from this example that there is much greater fear of being too timid than too bold in resorting to hypotheses for the solution of apparent discrepancies. Very important. Notice the resemblance of this to the situation of Mary Magdalene and the other women, and turning back and moving and everything. This kind of calibration by real history helps us to get over that static nature of New Testament scholarship. Okay. For harmonization, activate your real-world imagination. Jesus might have uttered some words on the cross that some people could hear and others didn't. Mary may have left the group before they went in and saw the angels and so forth. It's good to use imagination. The intelligent use of imagination, again, is a good historical tool. Tip number 5, reinstate the notion of casual variation. And I'm not going to read the Ebrard quotation. I can send you the my PowerPoint if anybody wants my PowerPoint. But he talks specifically about how natural it is for two cool and intelligent bystanders to give prominence to certain details rather than others. This is how truthful witnesses do things and talk. It is imperative that we reinstate casual variation, and we saw many examples where people didn't. Many variations, most in fact, are not going to have heavy explanations, and in particular, the ponderous machinery of redactive criticism is overkill and is epistemically unjustified to explain the kinds of variations for which it is usually employed. If you find yourself thinking that you have to explain he healed all in Matthew versus he healed many in Mark by some conjecture about Matthew's thinking, please stop and ask yourself, what is wrong with me? Tip 6, read old books. I was just reading Johannes Ebrard to you, of whom you may not have heard before. I hear of most of these from my esteemed husband, Tim, because he's the old books guy. Authors like William Paley, T.R. Burks, Johannes Ebrard, or J.J. Blunt did not have many of these problems. Stanley Leeds is another. T.R. Burks invented a great phrase, reconcilable variation, concerning different accounts where we can reconcile their variations with a good harmonization. That's actually evidence of their truth. This is exactly the opposite of prioritizing genre over harmonization. Okay. They were frankly willing to treat seriously the idea that the documents are engaging in factual reportage, even on matters of detail, and not to feel embarrassed by that. And I would put these men's knowledge of the original languages, of the nitty-gritty, and their learnedness up against anybody's. If you read these kinds of older books, you'll have the opportunity to develop a different community by using the democracy of the dead. And this will help you to recognize the bad habits, going back to tip number 1, rather than feeling that now this is my scholarly community, is the contemporary New Testament community, so I have to do things like them. Instead, get a wider community. These will help you not to feel that the habits of contemporary New Testament scholarship are the only real way to do things. So those are my 6 bad habits and 6 tips on how to avoid them. So at this point, I'm going to end my shared screen, and I'm going to stop share. Here we go.
Well, thank you.
And we're going to go to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for a very eye-opening and insightful presentation. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you'd like to submit questions for Lydia, then you can submit it using the Q&A button at the top of your screen, or you can also click the raise hand button at the top of your screen. We have 7 submitted questions so far. Callum asks, do you think scholars would benefit from keeping in mind Bayesian notions, for example, keeping in mind the prior probability of their hypotheses and separating it from how well their hypotheses explains the evidence?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because complexity can be modeled pretty well in Bayesian terms. We can model a more complex hypothesis as having a lower prior probability, and we can also be forced to consider that there are going to be multiple hypotheses that can explain the data, so that we don't just get fixated on one hypothesis, and then we can say, well, what about the hypothesis that Matthew remembered it differently or whatever, and consider whether that would actually do better at explaining the facts. So I would agree. Now, Bayesianism is not a cure-all. It's sometimes a case of garbage in, garbage out. So, you can plug in numbers that will not be helpful, but certainly anything that will help you think about complexity, for example, or help you order hypotheses from, let's try to do the simplest thing first, okay? Did they maybe just have a casual variation rather than a redactive one? Did they just remember it differently or whatever? It's going to be helpful. I use a flow chart in my, oh man, I forgot the URLs. I'm going to go back to share screen and share some URLs here real quick. I was in such a hurry. I have a flow chart in my series, and I really encourage you to read these posts. Let's go back to share screen here. And let's go to slideshow, view show. Click, 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 click. This is probably not the most efficient way to get to this slide, but it will get there. There we go. For more information. So I'm going to talk for a minute here. I'm going to keep this up for a few minutes while we do a few more questions, and then I'll stop the share in a second. So yes, Bayesian methods can be helpful, and it can help us to do the same kind of thing that I do with the flowchart in one of the early entries here in the Lacona entries. These are tiny URLs that are going to take you to series that I have done on these things. You can also email me at lydiamcgrew@gmail.com with questions, and I welcome that. Go ahead, Jonathan, read the next question.
Okay. King Servant says, are you suggesting gospel writers remembered and recorded events incorrectly? If so, would this not mean that God spoke things which were not true?
Right, so this gets us into the question of inerrancy. I take this inductively. I do not identify myself in an a priori fashion as an inerrantist. And I make this actually very clear in my posts, if you read my posts. But I want to go at this in historical fashion. I would consider it to be a really, really bad idea to say, well, we don't want to say that Matthew remembered something inaccurately, like what Jairus said, for example. So we'd rather say that he deliberately wrote it as if Jairus said something he didn't say. You know, this is sort of like if you're running along and you trip and you say, I meant to do that. You know, is it better if you say, I meant to do that, than if you just tripped? So you have to decide for yourself which of these you find theologically more palatable. I think it would be, and there are many inerrantists who think it would be a terribly, terribly Pyrrhic victory for inerrancy to attribute, to call it inerrancy when they're changing the facts. But I would also note that the vast majority of the things I'm talking about here wouldn't even have to involve an error. They could simply involve variations. They could involve one person remembering something that did happen, and then another person remembering another part of what happened. So I'm a big fan of harmonization, as you probably could tell. And in many, many of the examples, the majority of the examples I gave, there wouldn't even be a matter of remembering something incorrectly. In some of them, there might be. However, from a historical point of view, that would be a much simpler hypothesis than knowing what happened and deliberately changing what happened. And that, again, is what's important, because I was trying to talk about bad habits from an historical, epistemological, and philosophical point of view, that it's a bad habit to jump to the conclusion that somebody deliberately changed something as opposed to just remembering it differently. I would also note that simply not remembering something isn't an error in itself. Or simply not having heard something. So, for example, if Luke did not know about the flight into Egypt, and he writes that they returned to Nazareth, and he writes it in a way where you could read it as if they returned to Nazareth immediately after the days of Mary's purification were completed. But he doesn't say immediately. There's no word immediately there in Luke. Now, you have to decide whether it's consistent with your theory of inerrancy to say Luke did not know that they went to Egypt. He wrote as he did in some sense because he did not know that they went to Egypt, but he does not assert that they did not go to Egypt. So nothing that's actually asserted in the text is false at that point. There's just a lack of knowledge on the part of Luke, and he tells the story, part of the story that he's aware of. And I've actually asked an inerrantist what he would think if he would call that an error, and he said no. So, but I am trying to open up the toolkit of people who are jumping on this compositional devices bandwagon, because to my mind, that's the most important thing not to do. And I think inerrantists and I can make a very strong common cause here against that kind of procedure, me from a philosophical, epistemological, and historical point of view. I hope that answers the question.
And as I think I've said to you before, Lydia, the paradigm that I would promote or advocate for is one of methodological inerrancy, which is to say, for the purpose of investigation of the New Testament and for the purpose of harmonization, I would assume inerrancy, while recognizing nonetheless that if it turned out that there were peripheral errors in the gospel accounts or elsewhere in scripture, then that, although it might cause me to revise my view of inspiration and inerrancy, it would not undermine or undercut my confidence in the truth of the gospel as a whole, because the truth of the gospel rests upon the credentials of Jesus as evidenced by the resurrection from the dead. Right. And by the way, on the subject of the nativity and the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, it's interesting that so you mentioned earlier the Matthew or Luke specific details which are found in the infancy narratives, but that I think is best explained by the fact that Matthew is probably following a source from Joseph, whereas Luke is following a source from Mary, because you see they report the narratives as if it were given by Joseph and Mary respectively, right? Which
I strongly agree. Yeah, I think that's true.
That kind of one-sided reporting is something which is more expected on history than on fiction, I would argue. If you're just making up the story, then you just tell the story. You don't tell it from a one-sided perspective like that.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point that if they were just elaborating, why would they restrict themselves to elaborating from Mary's perspective? Why not, I don't know, elaborate from the perspective of the Magi or something, more, like tell us what countries they came from. I have all sorts of questions about the Magi that aren't answered in Luke's rather sparse version there. That's a very good point. I think I'm going to stop the share screen, but I'm going to come back to it later, if you guys want to get those URLs later on. Okay, here we are back.
Okay. Callum says, you mentioned Lacona and the Jerusalem Galilee Easter appearances. Is he doubtful of multiple appearances to the 12? Doesn't Acts start by noting Jesus appearing to them for 40 days, i.e. multiple times?
I don't know that he would necessarily doubt multiple appearances. What he says is that the first appearance is contradictory, as between Matthew on the one hand and Luke and John on the other. In other words, that that the one place is in Jerusalem and that the other, and he says it's the same. He insists it's the same appearance. He just says he doesn't really know what to do with this, and that they may have been following different reports, but he takes them to be contradictory concerning that location and those details. However, I as far as whether he's doubtful, regardless of whether he's doubtful or not, as I detail in my discussion of this, that does cast doubt on the multiple appearances. I mean, one can cast doubt on something without intending to cast doubt on it. I think that if you're saying that Jesus might actually have met his disciples first in Galilee, okay, that Luke and John on the one hand are contradictory to Matthew on the other hand, and he tries to assimilate Mark in here, but it's really weak because we don't have long ending of Mark, so I'm just going to leave that out. But contradictory to Matthew, then okay, maybe Matthew is right on this view, and Jesus first met his disciples in Galilee. What does happen at that point to, like for example, the second appearance, the Doubting Thomas sequence? Would the disciples, including Doubting Thomas, have immediately left Jerusalem on the word of the women alone, not even having seen Jesus themselves, and go all the way north, that's like 70 miles or more, to Galilee and first see Jesus there? So at that point, I think it does cast doubt upon the sequence as told in John. When you're putting these in conflict like this and then leaving it up in the air as to who's quote unquote right, perhaps he doesn't mean to cast that doubt, perhaps he himself is not doubtful, but that conflict, that artificially created conflict, does functionally, epistemologically cast doubt on some of these multiple appearances.
Do you think some of the tensions in the telling of the story, such as in the resurrection narratives or elsewhere in the Gospels, actually can be taken as evidence for their substantial reliability? Because although there are apparent tensions upon a first appearance, they nonetheless, that there are plausible harmonizations, and thus it's evidence for the independence of the narrations of those stories.
I think what you're talking about there is reconcilable variation, which is that phrase I was talking about from T.R. Burks. He was one of Paley's editors. And I think that makes sense because it's an interesting question. Why would John, if John really is writing later, okay, and he knew of presumably the tradition, even if we take it he hadn't read Matthew. I think he had read Matthew, but suppose we take it he hadn't read Matthew, but he knew of this tradition that Jesus met his disciples in Galilee and maybe supposedly, according to this theory, first met them in Galilee. Why would he have just written something blatantly contradicting that? Wouldn't he have expected people to question his document as a result? And this came up concerning something, I think it might have been the casting the disciples in a better light. I forget which example it was, and I was telling Tim about this, where supposedly Matthew had changed something from Mark to change people's perceptions. And he said, didn't Matthew know that Mark was circulating? How would he change people's perceptions by just contradicting Mark? If that is a contradiction, wouldn't you think that they would have tried to kind of piece it together a little bit better? So I think that fits with the point that you're making.
Right. Also, the case that we've talked about in the past about the evening meal that's recorded in John 12 and Mark 11, where where Jesus' feet are anointed at Bethany,
Right.
and John places that 6 days prior to the Passover, whereas Mark places it 2 days prior to the Passover, and so you've got this apparent tension, and that, although that's difficult to harmonize, nonetheless it suggests that such an event really did take place, and there's other variations in the telling of the story there as well, suggesting independence of the account. And so although there's a tension there, you can turn that on its head to make it actually an argument for the veracity of that story, right?
And even better, and I talk about this in my book a little bit, that 6 days before the Passover, that's such a kind of embarrassment there in John concerning the anointing of the feet, turns into the opposite of an embarrassment, because there is an undesigned coincidence connected not with the anointing of the feet per se, but with the number of days as counted off in Mark. John kind of fast forwards. John doesn't count off all the days like this in Holy Week. Mark does, right up into 2 days before the Passover. So you can count off those days, and it's so cool. So that he arrived in Bethany 6 days before the Passover is actually confirmed independently by Mark, and as you say, the accounts appear to be quite independent, even at a very point where we have a difficulty with harmonizing. So that's pretty cool.
Anonymous attendee asks, do you think that taking the gospel authorship seriously would help alleviate most of these habits?
You mean the traditional, I assume he means the traditional authorship, like Mark wrote Mark and so forth. It would help with a lot of them, but you'd be surprised. I gave the example where Dr. Lacona stands up before an audience, okay, and he seems momentarily to be taking Matthew and authorship very seriously. All right, he says, you may ask, why would Matthew have used Mark if he was an apostle? Well, that's because Mark had contact with Peter, so this was a high prestige source, and there were even some incidents like the Transfiguration that Matthew was not present for, and so forth. So he really seems to be taking Matthew and authorship seriously. But then he goes on to say, to give this scholarly view, which he appears to be endorsing, that scholars say that if the story's in both Matthew and Mark, then Matthew got it from Mark. Now, suddenly we're not really taking Matthew and authorship seriously anymore. So there's an arbitrariness to it. Because these bad habits are so deeply ingrained, the scholars don't always stop to ask themselves if they're being consistent. They don't always stop to ask themselves, hey, wait, if I think maybe really John did write John, why am I using this word source right here? If I'm taking Johannine authorship with any seriousness. So I don't know what it is, but it sometimes seems that New Testament scholars can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, or 6 contradictory things before breakfast. So not at one fell swoop, just because of the sociological forces that are at work here, the bad habits need to kind of be confronted on a case-by-case basis.
An anonymous attendee says, hi, Lydia, I enjoyed the lecture. You mentioned Midrash. Could you explain what it is?
Right. Well, this was in connection with the infancy narratives. Midrash was a rabbinic commentary. Actually, Jonathan's way better on this than I am, by the way, but he's going to be able to give you an even better answer. But it was a rabbinic commentary on a sacred text. So I consider it to be a very good example of Midrash when the Apostle Paul in Galatians says that the one mountain is Hagar and the other mountain is Sarah, and very odd, and cast out the bondwoman with her child. And he uses this as an argument for their not being circumcised, not following the law, and so forth. So he's taking the historicity of the events of Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael quite seriously, but then he's giving it this kind of typological commentary in order to make a theological point. That's an example of Midrash. Unfortunately, some New Testament scholars, Robert Gundry being one of the most infamous, took Midrash to mean the wholesale fabrication of events that never occurred. And it was interesting because when he was called on this by Douglas J. Moo in their debate, Moo sort of implied that he hadn't really made much of an argument, that these met some sort of criteria for being Midrash. And Gundry simply said, what I meant by Midrash was the spirit of free embellishment. That was, he didn't even have an argument for some kind of clear, criteria of there being Midrash. He just meant that Matthew was making stuff up, and that's what he meant by Midrash. Now, N.T. Wright, who is no fundamentalist, believe me, has been kind of excoriating on the use of the term Midrash to mean making up stories. And he says that's not what Midrash is. That's not ever what Midrash was just, and especially not recent past events. Just making up recent past events and just making them up. That's an incorrect use of the word Midrash. So I was really kind of surprised to see Dr. Licona reaching for that term. I think it's because he wanted a genre term, reaching for that genre term to refer to Matthew and Luke's inventing details for their narratives to, quote, make a more interesting narrative. And I think it's because people feel that if they can give a genre to something, then somehow this is more respectable. Is this the right section? Yes. He's talking about Bishop Spong. If there is anything clear about first century Jewish exegesis of scripture, it's that nothing is clear. What is central is that Spong apparently does not know what Midrash actually is. I'm quoting right here. The genre of writing to which he makes such confident appeal is nothing at all like he says it is. There is such a thing as Midrash. Scholars have been studying it, discussing it, and analyzing it for years. Spong seems to be unaware of the most basic results of this study. He has grabbed the word out of the air. Dear me. He misunderstands the method itself. Let me be clear, says Dr. Wright. I am not saying that the Gospels and the birth narratives have only a flat literal meaning. I have made it clear in various writings that they are written with great artistry. This is what I mean by his not being a fundamentalist, but they are not Midrash. So he's very clear about this. So that's not what Midrash was. So we shouldn't do that. If we're going to say that Matthew and Luke made up these portions of the narrative, just say they made up the portions of the narrative. But that doesn't sound so scholarly, and it might make some inerrantists upset because statements on inerrancy usually refer to genre. So if you can grab a genre term, you can then try to make out that this, even though it involves wholesale manufacture of entire incidents that are presented with apparent literal historicity, we can try to say this is compatible with some kind of neo-inerrancy or something. And that's just an abuse of the term. So that's my best shot at an answer to that question.
Anonymous attendee asks, do you think Richard Balcom is a good example who avoids these habits, especially in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses?
I want to say I have not read all of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, so I want to be careful about that. Not necessarily. Sometimes there are portions, yes, but I actually had an example from Balcom in a different version of this talk, where Balcom's talking about Levi and Matthew. So he starts off with this very a prioristic kind of thing from examining name frequencies and so forth. And he says it was very unusual for you to have two Hebrew names, such as Matthew and Levi, that were both common. Like if you wanted a name to distinguish yourself, you would usually use an uncommon name for the second name. So this causes him to just be very rigid that Matthew and Levi could not refer to the same person. So then you have the fact that, one gospel tells the story of the calling of Levi, and then Matthew tells this as the calling of Matthew. All right. And Balcom says, so it looks like the author of Matthew has transferred, here we go, with this kind of terminology, the story of the calling of some guy who was really named Levi to the calling of Matthew, the disciple who was known to be a disciple. But this means Matthew wasn't really written by Matthew. This is his argument against Matthew and authorship. Because if Matthew was really written by Matthew, he wouldn't have needed to transfer the story of the calling somebody else's story from some guy named Levi. He could have told his own story in his own words. Now, this is an incredibly weak argument. We're starting with this insistence that these names couldn't have been the same name from a sample. How many people do you know who have unusual names? People can definitely have unusual names. Then we're concluding from that as our next step that Matthew transferred the story, that it really happened to a guy named Levi, so he transferred it to Matthew. Then we're concluding, well, it couldn't have been Matthew because he wouldn't have transferred somebody else's story to himself. Now, that, I'm afraid, is an example of bad habits. That the preference of complex over simpler theories would be a category into which that would fall. So Balcom is still a New Testament scholar, and you just have to read these things sort of inductively. At this point, I don't give anybody a blank check. I always read the book for myself and evaluate each passage separately and say, okay, nah. And I would certainly advise doing that with Balcom, if for no other reason than that example is unfortunately all too New Testament scholar-y as an example of that kind of complex approach.
Tim B asks, hello, thanks so much for coming on. Would you agree that for the most part, redaction criticism of the Gospels could be rooted in an anachronistic view of an oral culture? What do you think of the idea of Mark originally being composed as an oral poetic of some sort, proposed by scholars such as Peter Botha? This would seem to dispel the assumption that Matthew had the Gospel of Mark in front of him while he was writing his Gospel.
Well, I think Matthew probably didn't have Mark in front of him when he was writing it, but not so much because of an oral thing. I think Mark was written down. I think, the early church fathers certainly support this, although I think it was written down from oral speaking. Mark, I think, as the fathers tell us, took notes from Peter's preaching in Rome and tried to write his account based upon that, and also presumably his acquaintance with Peter. So there's certainly a very strong oral component to all of this, but I think they were written down. Matthew probably did have access to Mark, but I would bring in something a little different than oral culture here to argue that Matthew didn't have access to Mark. This is something New Testament scholars never seem to talk about, except for Wenham, whom I've already mentioned: the lack of tables. Let it sink into your mind for a moment that there were no tables for writing, such as we have in the time when the Gospels were written. Also, that they were written on scrolls. Now, put together the lack of writing tables. When a scribe wrote, he would write on what we would think of as a lap desk. Okay, he'd have like a little lap desk, and he'd copy. So he might have a scroll like rolled open on the ground beside him and take notes or copy portions of it or something like that. Now try to put that together with redaction criticism. All right, the redaction critics, in fact, I don't have the page number right here, but Dr. Lacona expressly says that Luke and Matthew would have had Mark open in front of them. No, they absolutely would not. Even if they used Mark, all right, what we would be picturing would be, here's the scroll of Mark rolled way open over here on the floor. Here's, your scroll that you're composing on opened over on the floor here, and if you're Luke and maybe you're dealing with Matthew as well, maybe you have Luke rolling and you're crawling around on your hands and knees, okay? Maybe you're gonna move your scroll over here and you're gonna, no, this is entirely implausible. So what Wenham suggests is that even to the extent that they were to some extent literarily dependent, it involved opening one scroll, taking some notes, reading Mark or whatever, taking some notes, and also remembering it, having a good memory. And then you roll up that scroll and you compose your own scroll. You make an outline or whatever, and you compose your own scroll from your notes and your outline, and from additional material that you have, like Luke had, I think, additional witnesses, and Matthew had his own memories and so forth. So that, to me, is the biggest counter to the idea that they had Mark open. And this is a theory that I've never seen anybody use, that where you have a variant, even if Matthew was dependent upon Mark for that story, he may simply not have made a note of that particular exact wording or something in Mark, and might have been working from memory from Mark, or Luke from Matthew, or whatever it might be. So even within source and redaction criticism, we have people working from memory as well, which can create variance. But you will not find redactive critics admitting that. They treat it all, it's incredibly ponderous. It sounds like German in its ponderousness. They've got Mark open and they're thinking of every little, shall I change this word? I think that is not at all a correct picture of their method of composition, regardless of who you think composed the Gospels.
Lydia, how much further do you want to go? Do you want to wrap up?
I will be willing to stay here for another half hour at least, okay? Probably about another half hour, 35 minutes, something like that.
Okay.
If we've got questions coming in.
Sure. Let's see. Anonymous attendee says, you said a few times in your writings on the internet that you are coming at this from an epistemologist point of view. What do you mean by that? What does that entail? Just clarifying what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, that's my professional publishing background, and this comes up in my bio. I'm not sure if everybody always is aware of that, but that's what I've published in. It's called Theory of Knowledge, Epistemology, and I've also worked in specifically what's called formal epistemology. And in formal epistemology, we try to model the way that good inference works. Sometimes we model the way that bad inference works. Sometimes we use numbers, sometimes we use space, probability spaces, and so forth to model this. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about what is the best explanation. You can think about this in terms of inference to the best explanation. Is it a better explanation that an author, leaving aside for the moment the question of whether this is an inspired author or a sacred author, any author, it could be Plutarch, whether an author knew the truth, sat back and decided he was going to portray something in a way that is different from the truth, whether for a literary or ideological reason, and moreover, that his audience didn't care. Okay, that this was so widely accepted among his peers that even though they couldn't tell the difference, okay, they didn't mind. Okay, that they wouldn't really be able to tell, on these matters what was true and what was false from what he was writing, at least not on so-called matters of detail. That's a really, really what we call a really complex hypothesis. So that's one of the areas that I work in is complexity and modeling the effect of complexity upon our evaluation of theories. And we have to take that into account. So when I say I'm coming as an epistemologist, I mean as a theorist of knowledge professionally. I publish in peer-reviewed articles, blind peer-reviewed articles on this in secular topics and in secular areas. And it just doesn't work. And I could give you a number of different examples, but my answer would get too long, where I would show how, from an interdisciplinary point of view, I'm able to come in here and say, that's not how independence works. I've got several examples in mind where I see New Testament scholars referring to independent multiple attestation, but they've already cut off their right to use independent multiple attestation to support the truth, because their theory that they've just put forward about that very passage cuts them off from the resources of independent multiple attestation. That's an area of my professional work, quite separately, and they're misusing the concept of independence. So in these various ways, I'm able to come in and correct some of these bad habits and mistakes of New Testament scholarship by a kind of interdisciplinary critique. So that's what I mean by it.
Okay. Someone asks, does the large number of things that call for reconciliation surprise you? If Matthew had the Gospel of Mark before him, wouldn't you think he would be more careful to avoid the appearance of contradiction?
I don't know that there is as large a number that appear discrepant. I guess I tend to have a pretty high threshold before I even say there's an appearance of discrepancy. Maybe. I mean, I think there's some truth to that. And when I write in my book, I talk about this a little bit in Hidden in Plain View. I'll say, you've got these 4 accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. I think that's a good example, where one gospel will say, when he was getting out of the boat, he saw the crowds coming. And another gospel will say when he was up on the mountain with his disciples, he saw the crowds coming. Well, obviously, you're not getting out of the boat up on top of a mountain. Now, I guess I would acknowledge that's an appearance of discrepancy, though I think it can be harmonized, especially when we realize that it took all day. Feeding of the 5,000 was more like a fair than like a lecture. Okay, it was an all-day affair. Jesus was wandering around among the people, healing them, and so forth. But I admit it took me a few months to think of that harmonization. So yes, I would agree that does argue against having it open in front of them. Sometimes I think redaction critics think that they didn't mind the appearance of discrepancy because they assumed that their readers would just read their gospel alone for the literary, or maybe hear it read for a kind of literary experience. So that even if their audience would be aware of the other gospels, they would just kind of turn that part of their brain off and then go and listen. Hey, now we're going to listen to a reading from the Gospel of Matthew, and either not notice or not care about any apparent discrepancy because we're just kind of in this for the experience of listening to this gospel in isolation. And, the funny thing is, if this is about the most important things that have ever happened in the world, I don't think that's humanly plausible. And no one has ever independently defended that view. This is a good place for me to say this. All those generalizations I was reading to you from Burridge and so forth about fact versus truth and so forth, nobody's defended those generalizations. Nobody has. They are memes. Strictly speaking, those are memes in the sense of falsehoods that get believed because they get repeated, and they get repeated by high prestige sources. Ancient peoples, and this very, very broad sweeping notion of ancient peoples versus modern peoples. Nobody's ever shown us that ancient peoples didn't care about truth, and there's a lot of reason to think to the contrary, including the gospel writers and the early disciples' own insistence that they were telling what they had heard and seen. But that's a digression from your question. So.
Anonymous attendee asks, do you anticipate any change among New Testament scholars?
No. The short answer. It's a very inbred discipline, and that's so unfortunate. They will say to you, if you talk to a scholar who defends these kinds of methods, they'll cite a bunch of other people who agree with them within their own field, particularly the evangelicals. And so the evangelical niche, it's, there's quite a few people who work in that. They go to the SBL and they have their sessions and they read their papers to one another. And they go, oh, that guy is even further than I am. He goes even further than I do. So I go less far than this guy does, and I go further than that guy does. I'm right in the middle. I'm a moderate. Okay. So there's a lot of feedback. And if you're on Facebook, I am off Facebook right now, and I'm so happy to be off Facebook. If I was one of your Facebook friends, I do not hate you. I did not unfriend you. I simply went on Facebook hiatus, and I'm sorry if I didn't tell you in time. But if you're on Facebook, people tell me about what gets said on Facebook. There's all of this credentialism. Lydia has no right to critique this because she doesn't have a credential in New Testament scholarship and so forth. So this is why I don't anticipate they're changing, because they are affirming one another. Now, what I would like to see is individual people who maybe just wouldn't go down that path in the first place. They might be seminarians, they might be apologetics enthusiasts, they might be professors, they might be pastors, they might be laymen, whoever they are, who would hear about this work that's out there or would read some New Testament scholarship and would kind of, get partway into it. And then maybe they'd hear a talk like mine today, or they'd read my posts and they'd say, yeah, it doesn't seem right. So I could see something of a change at that level, with sort of stemming the tide to some extent. And that is what I am hoping for as my work is publicized more, and other critiques, and maybe if some other people would speak up openly and not just in private and say that they disagree with these approaches. I am going to be publishing an article in the Global Journal of Classic Theology, I believe it's called, which is edited by John Montgomery. He has invited me to publish an article about these topics, and that would be this coming summer that would come out. But I'm not going to boast or be under any illusions that that's going to cause some seismic shift. But we can talk to individual people. So I would encourage any of you who think I'm either right or at least worth listening to, or that these ideas are worth considering more vigorously, to publicize this debate and maybe make it something that gets discussed and that people think the second time about. That's the most I'm really hoping for.
Anonymous attendee asks, Lydia, which habit seems to be one likely to be dropped? Many scholars seem self-aware of the weakness of the argument from silence, and which habit seems most entrenched?
Boy, that's a good question. It's particularly hard to answer because they're all interrelated. So arguments from silence and overreading are in many instances the same habit. They're two sides of the same coin. So I think if it's labeled arguments from silence, that might be the one that's going to be dropped, but then they won't stop overreading. So even though that may actually be categorizable as an instance from argument from silence, they'll keep doing that. Maybe the overreadings that don't appear to them to be arguments from silence, for example. As far as the one that's most entrenched, I would take the one that is the most broadly applicable and under which many of the others could be subsumed as an umbrella, namely the preference for complex over simple theories. So that would be my answer.
Okay. Anonymous attendee says, do you think form criticism is a method which encourages these issues, or do you think redaction criticism is the main player?
Just a second. Say it again.
Sorry. Do you think form criticism is a method which encourages these issues, or do you think redaction criticism is the main player?
That's a good question. I think they tend to intersect. So, for example, saying, oh, this is this genre, could be seen as a kind of allusion to form criticism in a sense. These are Greco-Roman bioi, for example. So genre criticism for sure is walking hand in glove here with redaction criticism. But I would say that the ultimate goal is to make evangelical scholarship safe for redaction criticism. And I don't mean by that to say that anyone is insincere. I want to be careful how I put this. But I found it very interesting in reading these scholars to find how similar their conclusions were and how similar their errors were, so that discovering some allegedly new discovery about genre just took us back to the same old redaction criticism. It wasn't really anything new. Meet the old redaction criticism, meet the new redaction criticism, same as the old redaction criticism. So in the end, I think what they want to do is to do redaction criticism of a kind that's very popular in mainstream liberal scholarship, but they will use whatever comes to hand, as you saw in the case of the designation of the infancy narratives as midrash, for example. Or another example here would be Craig A. Evans's use of the term parable. So it's very interesting to see one guy he used parable and wisdom literature in the same breath. So he had parable, wisdom literature, midrash, Greco-Roman bioi. These are all, presumably different, right? Different genres. And isn't it an amazing thing that the conclusion that they bring us to all the time is that these guys were making a lot of stuff up? So I think that's kind of the common thread. The common theme is the willingness on the part of the gospel authors to revise the truth and to massage the truth for either literary or theological purposes.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from Pine Creek Doug, our friendly atheist interlocutor. Coming up, microphone here. Hey, Doug, are you with us?
Sam.
Yes.
Great to see
Hi,
you.
Lydia.
Hi, Doug. Here, you know what? I got to move my. There we go. I'm going to move my camera so I can see you on my screen.
Yeah, I just did the same thing. You remember me?
I do indeed. Oh, there we go. Now you're in a different part of my screen. Okay.
I guess my question is, if we're seekers of truth, does it ever give you pause that you have to harmonize, that you need to harmonize at least some of the scriptures? Like maybe
Not at all.
like especially when you hear other people do it of worldviews that you disagree with, like I would think that would give you at least a little bit of pause. Like Mormons, they harmonize, flat earthers harmonize.
Not sure what you mean by flat earthers, because they're not dealing with witness testimony to the flat earth or something. I mean, harmonization is very specific. I'm thinking of it as kind of specific kind of thing. You've got different accounts of an event or something, and you try to put them together. But I kind of answered this question in my talk, but I'm going to go back to it right now. Harmonization is not a religious process. Harmonization is a historical process. When I was doing my research that went into this talk, went into a big, long series on the internet of blog posts concerning the work of Dr. Licona, I did just as much work harmonizing Plutarch as I did harmonizing the Gospels. In fact, it took me more work because I was less familiar with Plutarch. I had already, researched various alleged discrepancies in the Gospels. So the normal characteristic of truthful human testimony is substantial agreement with circumstantial variety. That's how we usually find it when people are telling the truth. We even find apparent discrepancies. That was my example of the Swiss messenger. That had nothing to do with God or Jesus or the Bible or anything. That was just this account of this messenger being sent and sending people back and forth and so forth. So no, I'm not doing it because I'm a Christian. I do it with non-religious things as well, because that's a way to find out the truth. That is the best way to find out the truth.
But you said something earlier, and I forget what the context was. I think maybe it was the feeding of the 5,000. Mm-hmm. But you said, and I wrote it down, it took me a few months to think of that harmonization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do that with secular texts as well. You don't
but
understand.
To me, that sounds, well, that might be true. But when I hear that, I can't help but think, here's a person who desperately wants this to be true and is thinking of a way to make it so.
No, not at all.
Do you at least understand how it sounds like that?
So let me clarify. I'm not an inerrantist. I'm going to say that again. I'm not an inerrantist. I'm going to say that a third time. I'm not an inerrantist. All right. That was actually in my list of I call them candidate passages, where there may be a real contradiction. I could give you other examples as well, where I actually think it's not all that implausible that there is an actual contradiction. Somebody made a mistake, just made a mistake. So, I like to fiddle with things in my head. I would do this with any area of history that I was interested in. This happens to be an area of history I'm most interested in. I walk around and I fiddle with things in my head. All right. So I actually thought that was a real contradiction. Because I'm very open to that. I'm very open to that possibility.
Are you open to the idea that maybe when it says that 500 people saw the risen Jesus, that might not have actually happened?
I don't say it happened because of an a priori view of inerrancy, but there is not actually any contradiction to that in the text, so I don't see any reason to take it to be false. That I would consider it an unforced error to take that to be false, because there isn't even a discrepancy to be harmonized there. So again, as a historian, approaching this as an historian, that isn't even a discrepancy.
Right, so it's not a discrepancy, but I guess
I don't hold that a priori it's true.
I understand I understand it's not a discrepancy, but if you're coming from the point of view that you're willing, as an inerrantist, I'm assuming you're saying that you just don't take it at face value that if just because the Bible says something doesn't make it true. Is that correct?
I consider them to be historical sources, and then I inductively infer how reliable they are from my research. It's not that they're in, I'm going to assume that they've got to be true because it's in the Bible, and the Bible is my religious authority. So that's
Wait a minute, what
what
did you just say in the beginning of that sentence? You do assume it's historical sources?
I treat them as they're putative historical sources. Certainly on the face of them, they exist. And then I evaluate their reliability in an inductive fashion, just as I would with any putative historical
But are you
source.
open to the idea that when it says that 500 people saw the risen Jesus, that might not be historical?
It's not logically impossible that it is not historical.
Okay.
But I see no reason to think that it is not historical.
Well, maybe because it's only mentioned once.
Inductively. I think I've answered your question now, Doug. So I think we're going to move on to another question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Doug, for that. Okay, let's move on to, we've got a few more submitted questions. Let's see. Anonymous attendee says, Lydia, can you give one interdisciplinary example of independence in New Testament scholarship? I'm not sure what he...
Can you ask, does he mean, I think he means an error concerning New Testament scholarship. Because I said a few minutes ago that I could give examples where they erroneously try to claim independence.
I'm not sure if that's what he says.
Is that what he means?
Interdisciplinary example of independence.
Right, I said I could make an interdisciplinary critique because they misuse the concept of independence. So as a probability theorist, I can show how they're using it. I'm going to assume that's what he means, because I actually offered to give examples there. So he's probably taking me up on my offer. Sure, I'll give one right here. Since we've already been talking about the infancy narratives, this will make a good example. Dr. Lacona does that thing in the online debate with Bart Ehrman that I quoted at some length and had him in my slides, where he says that little else was known about Jesus' birth besides these very minimal facts that, he was born to a virgin named Mary, and she was espoused to a man named Joseph, and he was born in Bethlehem. I think those are the only 4 facts that he actually lists. And he says, besides this, little else was known. This is his hypothesis. He says he's not sure, but it's his hypothesis. And then that they invented these other details to make a more interesting narrative. Now, in that passage, I didn't quote this part, but he goes on right after that to say that he calls it the core, the part that they agree on. Now, this is only dubbed the core because it happens to be the part that's found in both of them. All he means by that is the overlap. So he dubs that the core. He says the core would be multiply attested, and the differences between them would show independence. And it would be, then the core would be multiply attested. Now, I'm going to give an example here so I don't have to get too technical. Suppose that Art and Bill both read the same newspaper account of a football game, and neither of them was present at the football game. Then Art and Bill go away and they make up additional stuff in addition to what was in that newspaper account. They just get creative with their imaginations to make a more interesting narrative. The independence between Art's and Bill's account is just an independence of their fabricating imaginations. All right? When we are dealing with independence of the kind that is helpful for affirming the truth of what is common to 2 accounts, we want the differences, what would make sense of the differences would be that they traced back to independent access to the event. Art and Bill don't have independent access to the event because their access to the event is the same newspaper story. All of the independence lies in their fictional imaginations. Now, similarly, if there was just this floating tradition that Jesus was born of a virgin, her name was Mary, Joseph was her espoused husband, and the baby was born in Bethlehem, and little else was known, and then the only independence, quote unquote, that we have between Luke and Matthew is stuff they made up. We have cut ourselves off from saying that what they agree on is multiply independently attested. You cannot, at that point, it's no better than one account to what they both attest. And since the differences are, according to this theory he's conjecturing, spinning out, due solely to their invention, then for all that theory says, that could be what it is, that they are relying on a common tradition that was all that was known, at this minimum that was known at the time, and they just invent everything else. They don't have independent access to the events. Therefore, no, sorry, that's not how any of this works, as the quotation goes. That's not how independence works. That's not how multiple attestation works. You can't say they're independent and their core is multiply attested, because it's the wrong kind of independence. It's just independence of invention. So that's an example where someone like me who works with testimony and independent testimony can come in and correct that attempt to sort of have your cake and eat it too, to say that they invented stuff, all this stuff that's not common, and then at the same time to then say, but I'm going to grab multiple attestation for the virgin birth. I'm sorry, you can't do that anymore. You just cut yourself off from that.
Great. An anonymous attendee says, this is an interesting question. Suppose that we find a handful of contradictions in the gospel narratives. How much evidential weight would you give this as evidence against the general reliability of the gospels?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it's going to be a statistical matter, because you're going to have to compare that to the percentage of places where we find really good harmonization, and the percentage of places where we find undesigned coincidences and other marks of truth in specific narratives. So the handful, it's not going to be like a handful and everything else is white noise. It's going to be a handful of apparent discrepancies that we are having trouble reconciling, and maybe they're not reconcilable, or maybe there was an error, to all this other stuff that is confirmed and that appears to be true, even on matters of detail. And we're going to have to get kind of a statistical calibration going on there, so that we're going to be able to say, I think in the end, if it's only a handful and then we've got this positive evidence elsewhere, that they're very, very highly reliable, just as a matter of, M over N instances or proportions of discrepancies to the rest of the stories.
Given that there are, given that there is evidence that the gospel authors were familiar with each other's works, why do you think that there are tensions between the gospels, given that they had presumably read each other's works already?
Some of them did. I mean, that gets us into the question of what order they were written in, right? Mm-hmm. Was Luke familiar with Matthew? I'm inclined to think he was, but not everybody agrees. Was Mark, if Mark was the earliest gospel, then he probably wasn't. All right. John, I think, was familiar with all the other three, but there's a huge scholarly disagreement about that. Some people think John hadn't even read the others. But I think they probably, some of them had. I think Matthew had read Mark, and Luke had read Mark and Matthew, and John had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think it's about that order. I think there is a lot of orality there. I think when we get John, especially, he's sitting down and he's telling what he's thinking of. He's not bothering to polish all the edges. He's not bothering to go back and open up Matthew, Mark, and Luke and say, oh, gee, somebody might get confused. I need to write that. We also need to remember this is not a world with word processing. Okay, I can even remember the days when we did everything on a typewriter, and changing something was a pain, even with an electric typewriter. Well, now imagine if you have a scribe and a great big scroll, and you've written it out. If you realize later, or you happen to wake up, John wakes up at 3 a.m. and says, oh, stink, I said that happened 6 days before the Passover, and Mark says it happened 2 days. Man, which was it, He's not even going to have an easy way to go back and change it. So I think that shows sort of the unstudied natural nature of the process of composition.
Mm-hmm. Yep. A question on inerrancy, since it came up a few times. So a lot of people who are inerrantists raise a concern when someone like yourself or others would would depart from a sort of a conservative traditional conception of inerrancy, and they would say, well, this once you open the door for there being potential errors in the Bible, then where do you stop? And how do we know that? I mean, it gives rise to kind of a slippery slope kind of idea. How would you address those concerns?
I think we would approach it historically. And I think we would say, well, what do we appear to have? And so again, historically and inductively. And even if, let's say, just for the heck of it, let's say John misremembered what day Jesus' feet were anointed in Passion Week. Well, then, like I pointed out, it's at that very point in the text that we find his memory is also confirmed as how many days before Passover Jesus came to Bethany. So it's like we've got a slip, maybe possibly a slip of the memory in the very same verse where we have the rather uncanny accuracy of his memory confirmed. So what we find is by calibrating, again, we get a really high view of their reliability. And I think that stops a slippery slope. On the other hand, if I may seem to be beating a drum, I would say there's a lot more argument for that when you have them deliberately fabricating material, when you have them deliberately changing things. And I use an example a lot here. Imagine that you have a witness on trial, or sorry, a witness in a trial, in a courtroom. And he stands up and he says, he's being questioned, and he says, the event happened on Saturday. Then a different witness comes up and contradicts him and says, no, the event happened, some event happened the following Wednesday. And of course, cross-questioning, adverse counsel's all over this. They get the first guy up there again, they grill him. So you were wrong, when you said it happened on Saturday, it really happened on Wednesday. And the witness says, I'm sorry, now that you mention it, now that you describe all of that, you're right, it did happen on Wednesday. I just made a slip, sorry. And he admits that, all right? Now, let's contrast that with a different scenario. You have the same witness, same thing happens, and then you get him up there for cross-questioning. Admit it happened the next Wednesday. And he says, oh, I knew all along that it happened the next Wednesday. I changed it. It was a literary device. How much of that guy's word are you going to take for stuff anymore? I submit that if the gospel authors were changing things on purpose, that does call their truthfulness into question for other things. All the more so since these so-called devices are never tagged in the text. And I was hoping I would get a chance to say that tonight and have this recorded. Nobody here is claiming, Dr. Lacona is not claiming, Dr. Evans is not claiming, these guys are not claiming that there's some kind of little secret decoder ring that you can wear, and you go and you read the Gospel of John and you kind of pass your decoder ring over the text and it lights up green or something, or yellow or something. This is the part that he changed. No, these are written as if it happened the way that they say. They are not detectable from within the text. Someone like Dr. Lacona claims to have detected them by comparing the texts and by hypothesizing that some compositional device was used or something like that. But if you have this guy on the witness stand and he said it in this very apparently truthful way, it happened on Saturday, and then later he says, oh yeah, basically, jinx, fooled you. It was actually the following Wednesday. I always knew that. It was a literary device. And you couldn't tell when he originally said it that you are going to need to question other things that he says. And interestingly, I think this is really what Dr. Lacona means by prioritizing genre over harmonization. That is what he's doing at that point. He's going in there, and even when he could harmonize, even when there could be a harmonization, he's trying to do the literary devices first. So that's where we get real problems with trusting and reliability, and why do I accept any of this anymore? Not so much where there's just some small error that can be, in a sense, isolated and doesn't affect the intention on the part of the author to speak truthfully, and his success in that respect in a great many cases.
What do you think it means for Scripture to be theopneustos, or God-breathed, as per 2 Timothy 3:16-17?
I don't know. I don't have a worked out theory of inspiration, and I suppose that's partly because I'm not a theologian. I'm approaching this in a more historical, sort of nitty gritty ground level way than as a theologian. But I will say just this much. As you've often pointed out, the apparent discrepancies are actually helpful in many ways, as they show this casualness and the living voice of the witness. And so it may be that the Holy Spirit had a reason for leaving them in there. And that's maybe a slightly radical approach, but I'm glad that the Holy Spirit did it that way, in whatever the exact theological nature of his involvement was.
Because when people get so hot under the collar when it comes to things like inspiration or inerrancy, my concern is that we have to be careful, because Scripture doesn't actually explicitly say anything about inerrancy. We're told in 2 Timothy 3:16-17 that all Scripture is theopneustos, which in that particular context is alluding to the Old Testament Scriptures. But Paul's letters are identified as Scripture. You can make an argument that the Gospels are identified as Scripture, Revelation's identified as Scripture, etc. But what does it mean for Scripture to be theopneustos, or God-breathed? We're not actually told explicitly what that means. I mean, Peter writes that men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. But what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, are we really suggesting that is Mark or is John or is the author of 2 Kings or what have you, was writing his document about what happened, and then
what did it feel like, right?
Yeah, he makes a slip, and John records that the anointing took place 6 days rather than 2 days before the Passover, and the Holy Spirit stops him and says, "Stop," and changes.
What does it feel like? What does it feel like to be John? What did it feel like to be Paul? And I don't know, but my guess is that it felt pretty human. My guess is that it was interesting. Tim was talking about undesigned coincidences, I believe, to one person one time. They weren't even talking about inerrancy. I think this was a skeptic. And the person said, that sounds like a very human sort of thing, those undesigned coincidences. Why would you expect to find those in the Bible? And I thought that was amazing, that the skeptic believed that we needed to cut ourselves off from these human characteristics that would even confirm the truth of what was said. I want to get in one more sort of whack here real quickly, which is that ultimately the approach that I'm advocating, this natural approach to a natural concept of eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, is quite incompatible with this heavy approach of redaction criticism. And, my hearers might be saying, well, no, duh, obviously. But I mean that in a pretty strong sense. You can't just opportunistically go along, and when you're kind of running with the New Testament scholars, then it's, everybody redacted everybody in this really very deliberate way. But then when you want to put on your apologist's hat, and you say, oh, look, they have the marks of eyewitness testimony. You can't do both of those. If the majority of the differences between the Gospels and among the Gospels are due to this heavy designed approach, then you aren't going to expect marks of undesign. You aren't going to expect marks of that casual truthfulness. Casual truthfulness arises from casual writing and casual speech and casual composition. Casual truthfulness doesn't arise from heavy redactive fictionalization. You're not going to get undesigned coincidences there, and that's where you're not going to expect to find undesigned coincidences. And this is why on several occasions, I gave one example in my talk, and there are several others, Dr. Lacona misses undesigned coincidences because he's not looking for them. He's looking for design rather than undesigned. So these are very different.
Yeah, I've actually asked Dr. Lacona what he thinks of the argument from undesigned coincidences, and he says that he doesn't find it strong enough for him to use it himself.
Well, he would do better to use that than to saw off the branch he's sitting on in the way that I believe he is doing as far as the reliability of the text, because then you're just not going to be left with very much. But that's an interesting comment. To me, that bespeaks a difficulty with the messiness of history and the way that historical veracity actually is manifested in the Gospels. And that fits, of course, with the earlier book that he wrote, where he used this phrase, I think it was a very, very ill-chosen phrase, historical bedrock. And there's this confusion that an argument is strong if everybody agrees with it, or if everybody agrees with its premises. And then that's where we feel secure. And that's where we get into things like a very strong, very limited minimal facts approach, which is really what Dr. Lacona's earlier book on the resurrection was all about. That we think we're giving a strong argument, but we're really not. We're giving a very, it's what we might call a drag racer, a dragster argument. We've stripped off everything we can possibly strip off and conceded everything we can possibly concede to the liberal scholar or to the skeptic, and then we think we have a strong argument. Okay? Then we think we have a strong argument. That's not a strong argument. Actually, that's actually a pretty weak argument, because you've stripped your dragster down here. You don't have any redundancy. You don't have a cumulative case anymore. And you've cut yourself off from everything besides what you've chosen to label as historical bedrock. Cutting yourself off from undesigned coincidences is a very, very bad move. We need to make use of all of the evidence.
Right. I know that he had read Blunt's book. He hadn't read your book, but I think he liked some of them. For example, he liked the ones about the trial narrative before Pilate in the Gospels between John and the Synoptics, but he didn't like most of them, as far as I recall.
Now, it's interesting you say that. Are you getting that from the book or from something he said to you in private? He alludes to something like this in the book about the trial narrative. Are you getting that from the book?
No, just a conversation I had with him.
Okay, well, I want to make a comment about that concerning the trial narrative. He does allude to what I would call the data that goes into one or two of the undesigned coincidences there in the trial narrative and the conversation that Jesus had with Pilate. But actually, he doesn't acknowledge it as an undesigned coincidence. He trips up in his attempt to describe it as an undesigned coincidence. Instead, he says, I don't know if that's what he thought he was describing. Maybe he doesn't use the term, but he says, this would be expected if both Luke and John had access to a tradition much like what we find in John. That's almost a verbatim quote, because I've read the passage many times. Wrong, mistake, error. No. First of all, we don't have any reason to believe that Luke had access to something much like what we find in John. Indeed, if Luke had access to something much like what we find in John, then Luke would be expected to include more. We'd be less expected to find the undesigned coincidence. He doesn't even know how to do the undesigned coincidence when maybe he thought he was. And he is using it to kind of confirm John's historical accuracy, but then he kind of backs off the next minute and says, however, it's impossible to tell whether John constructed this with literary artistry. You know, like, heaven forbid I should commit myself to John's really being strongly accurate at this point. But he kind of uses it to confirm John's accuracy, but when he's articulating it, he says this would be well explained if they both had access to something like what we find in John. No, actually it looks like Luke had access to part of it, and John had access to part of it, or remembered part of it, or something like that. Maybe Luke had a witness who told part of the story, and so forth. And once again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring them both back to a tradition. Okay, we're always putting this tradition, we can never bring them back to reality. Okay, this would make sense if they both had access to a tradition, much like what we found in John. The redaction critic won't give up. The redaction criticism won't die. We've always got to do it in these redactive terms, redacting a tradition, even if we don't have a text to redact. So he finds it super difficult to actually comprehend undesigned coincidences on their own terms, as I might say, and really understand how they work. That one person remembers part of it, or a witness remembers part of it, and another person remembers part of it, or a witness remembers part of it accurately, and then these two fit together.
Right. Anonymous attendee says, philosopher Stephen Davis takes a similar position to yours in denying inerrancy by having a high view of the Bible and reliability. However, he does admit as a philosopher, stating, quote, "There is no denying that stories about Jesus were translated, edited, paraphrased, and recontextualized," end quote. What do you think of philosopher Stephen Davis's conclusion here? And then he gives a source, which is J.P. Moreland, Debating Christian Theism.
Well, I would like to ask philosopher Stephen Davis for some examples. Whenever anybody makes a really sweeping statement, there is no denying that they were, use some big word like contextualized. My immediate question is like, what? Give me an example. What do you mean? I might deny it, because phrases like that about contextualizing or using literary artistry or doing things for their own separate purposes or whatever are often allusions to these kinds of what I would call fictionalization actions, where they're deliberately changing what they know to be the facts because they have some point they want to make, or they want to suppress something or whatever. And I don't think they ever did that. I mean, this is why, I saw somebody in a blog thread, he called me an inerrantist in all but name, which I thought was kind of an interesting phrase. And I've heard the phrase near inerrantist, but it really has nothing to do with inerrancy. It has to do with what I inductively am learning about these gospel authors, that they weren't out there to change stuff. They were out there to report. They were witnesses. They considered themselves primarily witnesses. So all of those words that Davis uses there, my antennae are twitching a little bit. And I suspect, my guess is that because he's a philosopher, rather than a New Testament scholar, he probably is accepting a lot of this uncritically from New Testament scholarship. And this is where we who are not New Testament scholars need to be willing to walk into this very inbred discipline and start questioning it on its own terms, rather than just sort of accepting the data as data. Okay, the New Testament scholars say they massage the fact, I guess they must have. I would guess that that's perhaps what Davis is conceding there, thinking he has to, because that's what the consensus of scholarship agrees to. Let's take one more question. Whoops, your sound is off.
Sorry. Okay, one more.
There we go.
Let's see. Okay, here's let's take this question from Kevin. It says, Anglican theologian J.I. Packer, in a speech called Problem Areas Relating to Biblical Inerrancy in 1987, says, quote, "A third point has to do with the conventions of speech. All the historians of the ancient world reported that what people said by convention, that is the exact opposition of ours. If they knew the substance of what was said, they felt free to construct a speech, sentences, and paragraphs of direct speech in which words are put in the mouth of the character. In the modern era, even when we know what the direct speech was, what words the person actually used, we prefer to report the substance of what the person said in what we call reported speech. In the Bible, it is unwarranted to think the accounts of speeches on spying are necessarily epistema verba, and then to base problems on that supposition. Reportorial conventions are not errors," end quote. What do you think about what Packer has to say here as a theologian and not as primarily a New Testament scholar?
Well, I would make a couple of distinctions. First of all, notice the use of ipsissima verba versus there. I would make a distinction between speeches in the sense of like a big long speech, okay, and speech in the sense of something anybody says, like even dialogue or something like that. So speeches versus speech. Where we have a larger amount of evidence regarding willingness to make up speeches, sometimes even without a gist of what was said, in ancient literature is with regard to speeches in the more formal sense, not just any spoken word, but a long, like a set speech. And we do have evidence that some authors engaged in that. Sometimes they didn't even have a very good gist of what was said. and they just made this up. The famous line, "They make a wasteland and call it peace," comes from a invented speech by, I think it's Tacitus. I'd have to look it up. For a Scottish chieftain, Calgacus, it's sort of like a freedom. He's making fun of he's giving a hard time to the Romans, but he wouldn't have expressed himself in that way at all. It's probably an entirely invented speech. So we do find invented speeches. We also find other people like Polybius who are ranting against that. They are against it. So it was not just generally accepted even to make up set speeches. Now, when we get to speech in the just really broad sense, like anything that is attributed to anybody that he said, certainly they didn't have quotation marks. All right, so the distinction between indirect speech, we use the word "he said that," and "he said, comma, quote." All right, that distinction could certainly get somewhat fuzzified just because of the lack of those conventions. So we would have somewhat of a paraphrase that might be put in what we would think of as direct quotation, but that's not even, we don't even have evidence there of the same sort of freedom that we have evidence for set speeches. Now we're going to move to yet a further question concerning the gospel authors themselves, because the fact that we find Tacitus making up a speech, even when it's a set speech, doesn't mean that we're going to find Luke making up a speech, and it certainly doesn't mean that we're going to find Luke making up sayings of Jesus, where it's not a set speech, where it's just dialogue. Okay, so we have to evaluate them on their own terms, and it's very interesting. There are discussions of the different accounts that Paul gives of his conversion. And it's very interesting to see in the book of Acts how even these, which are undeniably speeches in the big sense of a speech, appear to be a lot closer to Paul's ipsissima verba than that kind of statement might lead us to expect. I'm not saying they aren't paraphrased at all, okay, but that they appear to be very fitted to their audience. They appear to be told in different ways depending on the occasion and so forth, very much as we would expect Paul himself to have done. Colin Heemer has wonderful, wonderful discussions of this kind of thing in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, as an entire appendix on the speeches in Acts. But certainly when it comes to speech, just in the sense of stuff Jesus said, I would stick to a concept of ipsissima vox that would be the narrower concept. And I think we can stand on that they may have paraphrased and not used absolutely the precise words in the way that we might ourselves, not though because, back then they just made up stuff that people said. So I think in a sense, Packer is sort of melding together different things in the ancient world there and not making all of the distinctions he needs to make, and then that we need to be careful how we apply that to the Gospels.
Okay, well, thank you, Lydia, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. It's been really insightful. Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me. And guys, if you have additional questions, please feel free to write to me. I'm going to just real quick here at the very end, I'm going to put up share screen and put up those URLs one last time, okay? Because I want people to have that. And I know this is the ugly version. So I made tiny URLs for all of these. So you go to tinyurl.com and you've got W4 New Testament. I don't even think they're case sensitive. W4 Lacona, and Lacona summary is to a particular that's to a particular post where I give a synopsis of each one of my 2017 Lacona posts. And then these are tags at What's Wrong with the World, where I and they're partially overlapping. Some of the things in New Testament are the things in Lacona. All of the things in Lacona are the things in New Testament, but there's some non-overlapping material there too. So feel free to go there or ask me if you want more info.
Tim B in the chat said, Nick's Lydia McGrew appearance on the podcast should be minimal versus maximal facts.
That would be fun. I would like to do that. And I'll remember to flick my light on that time so when it gets dark, I don't become fuzzy. Anyway, I will see you guys later. Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. I can't thank you enough for having me.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
coming. Take care. Bye.